Thank you so much for joining our journey to increase healthspan for lots of, and hopefully all Singaporeans. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here face to face. And thank you for all of you at the moment being on Zoom. It's a hybrid meeting, and hopefully we will have lots of interactions and discussions, not only with you here in the room, but also the ones on Zoom. I'm Andrea Meyer. I'm co-leading the Centre for Health and Longevity together with Professor Brian Kennedy. And our aim is to increase not only lifespan, but especially health span. And that's very important because nowadays the lifespan in Singapore is one of the best on earth. And I think we have to celebrate that, because this is because of modern medicine. I'm a physician, and I'm so proud that I have antibiotics, that I have colleagues, surgeons, who are fixing the body, who make it better. And I think we should celebrate that our lifespan is so high worldwide, but especially in Singapore. But there is a but. We are growing old with lots of diseases, and we know why the diseases occur. We know why we are aging, and we know that chronological age is the biggest, the highest risk factors for all the age-related diseases. And that's what we try to solve, I and Brian Kennedy, with lots of very enthusiastic colleagues of ours, to actually see how we can reverse that trajectory until somebody has an age-related chronic disease, how we can prevent that. So that's a reason why it's so nice that you are with us on the journey, on the opening of the Centre of Health and Longevity today. We have 350 people today face-to-face here, and we have more than 700 online. So thank you so much. Very important that this is not a conference just in Singapore. We have participants from roughly 13 plus countries. And I think this really contributes, this conference, to the entire ecosystem we are going to build here in Singapore. There are 3 parts this day. We are going to open the Centre for Health and Longevity. So this is, of course, dear to our heart, and you will see what's going to happen. And then we have 2 parts of scientific lectures, which are very important. The first one more preclinical, and the other was clinical. And then we have 2 panel discussions to really ask the question, is Singapore ready to implement longevity medicine into clinical practice? Can we actually extend in all Singaporeans the health span? I would like to give a very, very special welcome to our Deputy Prime Minister, who is also the Coordinating Minister for Economic Policies, but he is also the Chairman of the National Research Foundation, which is, of course, very important for us. Mr. Heng Swee Keat, thank you so much for being here. A special applause for him, please. I think it's so important that you are here, and knowing that the Centre for Health and Longevity is now live here, and we really want to work with you, with your colleagues, to increase health span. Thank you. The opening address and speech is going to be given by our Senior Vice President of the National University of Singapore and the Chief Executive of our National University Health System, Professor Yo Kei-Guan. May I ask you to the stage? There you are. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Deputy Prime Minister and Coordinating Minister for Economic Policies and Chairman of the National Research Foundation, Mr. Lee Po Hua, CEO, Lian Foundation, Professor Chong Yap Sing, Dean of the Yong Loo Lin School of Medicine, Professor Brian Kennedy, Director, Centre for Healthy Longevity, and Professor Andre Meyer, Co-Director of the Centre for Healthy Longevity. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, good morning and welcome to the inaugural Longevity Science Singapore Conference organized by the NUHS Centre for Healthy Longevity. This is a very topical area. The US National Academy of Medicine Summit on Healthy Longevity was just held in this very auditorium 2 weeks ago, and today we once again welcome DPM Heng again as our guest of honor. To everyone here in the auditorium and online, thank you for joining us today to hear from the world's leading experts on the latest strategies, discoveries, and implementation of longevity interventions to improve and transform health span at the individual and population level. The world is seeing a trend of longer life expectancy, which combined with market decline in fertility rates is resulting in a rapidly aging world population. And Singapore is among the fastest aging countries in the world. By 2030, 1 in 4 Singaporeans will be aged 65 and older, and this group will number 1.8 million. This extraordinary improvement in life expectancy is in fact one of humanity's greatest achievements of the last century and should be celebrated. And rather than seeing this as a burden to society, the US National Academy of Medicine's Global Roadmap for Longevity report, published in June this year, calls for a paradigm shift on how we view aging and the aged. There are intrinsic assets accrued in older age, in social, financial, and human capital. And an aging population means that society stands to benefit from these assets of older age at an unprecedented scale. As an example, it's often thought that by remaining in the workforce, older people compete with and perhaps deprive those younger of jobs and opportunities to advance. This lump of labor fallacy wrongly assumes that economies are inelastic. In fact, recent studies in North America, Europe, and Asia show that higher workforce participation among older people are correlated with more jobs for the young because it grows the economy and is likely to result in an enlarged workforce, stronger economy, helping people of all ages to thrive. The National University Health System fully supports the report's recommendations, and we will contribute in the following ways to help Singaporeans achieve healthy longevity and realize this longevity dividend. Firstly, as part of Healthier SG, NUHS will reach out to the population, focusing on preventive health and early intervention with a life course approach with the aim of keeping Singaporeans of all ages in good health. Secondly, current scientific evidence supports the potential for health span to approximate lifespan, where years in good health approach the biologic lifespan and physical, cognitive, and social functioning is preserved. Age is now viewed as the most important risk factor for many diseases, such as cancer, cardiovascular, and neurodegeneration. So NUHS and NUS will tap on cutting-edge science and medicine, harness technology and innovation to develop novel interventions aimed at extending health span, mitigating aging, and prolonging functional capacity. The NUHS Centre for Healthy Longevity was thus established to translate key findings in the biology of aging to help people increase health span and promote healthy longevity. Located at the NUHS Alexandra campus, the center is the clinical and translational partner of the complementary Healthy Longevity Translation Research Program at the NUS Yong Loo Lin School of Medicine with a dedicated laboratory at the NUS campus. And under the sterling leadership of Professors Brian Kennedy and Andre Meyer, both key opinion leaders in the field of geroscience, the center has launched several notable flagship studies, including the Aging Biomarker Study in Singaporeans, or ABIOS, which in partnership with Peking University screens a comprehensive suite of physiologic parameters and biomarkers to generate novel predictors for healthy aging, which can be used as biomarkers for clinical intervention. And the ABLE study, which investigates whether daily intake of a nutritional supplement, alpha-ketoglutarate, for 6 months can slow biologic age compared to placebo control. The center also aims to launch the world's first longevity medicine clinic at Alexandra Hospital, focused on dietary, exercise, and supplemental interventions to mitigate the adverse effects of aging and extend health span. Just like health healthy longevity is the outcome of complex systems and many determinants. To achieve healthy longevity, we will need to activate, transform, and coordinate multiple systems and stakeholders within society. Recognizing this, NUHS has partnered NUS and HDB in the Healthy District at Queenstown project, a multi-stakeholder collaboration bringing together expertise in infrastructure, healthcare, and social care. This project will pilot impactful community and population health initiatives in a geographic vanguard with the aim of developing scalable, sustainable programs that increase health span and can be rolled out for the rest of Singapore. Reimagining how we age will be an all-of-society effort, and we are grateful to work with partners like the Lian Foundation, who share our aspiration to help elders live out their best lives with purpose, meaning, dignity, and in good health. The Centre's work is made possible with their generous support. Thank you. The Centre invites members of the public to their open house at Alexandra campus tomorrow, 8 September, to learn more about the latest in aging and longevity research. And this program includes free public talks, a guided tour of the Centre, as well as opportunities to interact with researchers, tools, and instruments. The growing public interest in being longevity ready, as well as the new advances made in longevity science, are encouraging signs that this paradigm shift is indeed possible, and we can eagerly look forward to a future where 90 is the new 50. In conclusion, please join me in thanking Professor Brian Kennedy, Professor Andre Meyer, and DPM again, and a whole team for conceiving and organizing this meeting. I wish all of you a very fruitful and enjoyable symposium. Thank you.
We have thank you so much for your inspiring talk. We have a very tiny present for you, and we would like to give it to you. You are the first one to receive this paper cut, and this is actually Clinic L at Alexandra Hospital, so hopefully it will have a nice place in your office. May I? Oh, you're already there next to me. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So now we will see a very short video to give a little bit you an impression about the Centre for Healthy Longevity.
Living longer is possible, and living longer healthily is critical. Growing old might be part and parcel of life, but with the right solutions, aging can be slowed down or even reversed. The NUHS Centre for Healthy Longevity commits itself to add healthy years of life by delaying aging, prolonging disease-free life, and maintaining high functionality.
We try to understand why we are aging, and while knowing why we are aging, we can make treatments for the aging process itself that you and me, that we can slow down our aging process and therefore prevent age-related diseases.
Healthy lifespan, or health span, is the period of time in life that you're largely disease-free, that you're highly functional, and that you have a high quality of life. And the problem is that lifespan has been going up steadily, but healthy lifespan is going up at a lesser rate, so that we're extending people's lives, but we're also extending the period of time they're sick at the end of life.
The Centre uniquely translates knowledge from laboratory models to humans, developing biomarkers to measure our biological age, which serves as a yardstick to test various interventions to slow aging. Furthermore, interventions are being tested under which first-in-man trials to extend healthy life expectancy are carried out. Knowledge is being transferred to clinical practice to be available for all of us.
There are a couple of interventions already we can apply at this moment in time that we slow down the aging process. We have three important pillars, and that's lifestyle, and that's supplements, and that's the use of drugs, and maybe also repurposed drugs. We are giving drugs all the time in clinical practice for certain diseases, but we can repurpose these drugs, such as metformin, which lowers the glucose level, but we can also give, for example, ACE inhibitors, which lowers the blood pressure, to therewith interfere in the aging process, using these drugs to make somebody younger.
We have a number of collaborators, professors, not just in NUHS, but across Singapore that have been working with us to try to solve some of the problems of aging. But we've also had a lot of support from the public and philanthropic organizations, one of which I have to mention, that's the Lien Foundation. They've been very generous, and their support has allowed us to start our clinical intervention studies to try to prove that we can alter human biologic age.
We are bringing top research together at the Centre for Health and Longevity with different specialities. We not only know how to measure the aging process, which is very important, but we also know how to intervene. And these capacities we all bring together in one center, and that's the Centre for Health and Longevity.
Our rapidly aging population presents one of the greatest challenges Singapore has yet to see. Longevity research and implementation will have a strong impact on both economic and social issues.
I think the most important thing to understand is that we're not just trying to make people live forever. We're trying to keep people healthy. They're trying to intervene in people while they're still healthy and give them happy, long, healthy, functional lives.
Prevention is better than cure. Aging with a younger, functional, disease-free body is possible, and intervention begins today. Because by transforming the way we age, we secure a healthier future.
Thank you so much for your applause of this video. The next opening address will be done by Professor Chong Yap Seng. And I must add an individual note. I'm so grateful for your support for the center. Not only that you know so much about aging research yourself, but also your guidance. So thank you so much. Professor Chong is the Dean of the Yong Loo Lin School of Medicine at the National University of Singapore. The floor is yours.
So before I start, I just want to draw your attention to the screens on the sides. I believe they are showing some slides, right? So, and you know me, I'm a true academic. I can't do anything without PowerPoint slides. So hopefully the screens are showing the slides. So good morning, Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Professor Yo Guan, Chief Executive, NUHS, Mr. Lee Po Wah, CEO, Lien Foundation, Professors Andrea Meyer and Brian Kennedy, co-directors of the NUHS Centre for Healthy Longevity, esteemed guests, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. There's much excitement now about the 100-year life, right? But not only excitement, but some trepidation. So with a 100-year lifespan on the horizon, Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat recently mentioned that it's key for Singapore to unlock the longevity dividend. So the question we have to ask is, would we want a 100-year lifespan to become the norm if we have to spend 15 to 20 of those years in bad health? If not, we have to act now to enable Singaporeans and people everywhere to not only live longer, but to also live more years in good health. That is, we have to start thinking about lifespan. And the important thing is that lifespan shouldn't be something that we only think about when we are older. What can we do to improve health span across the life course? I think Andrew Scott has mentioned, and I'd like to think of 100-year life course in 3 phases: the current old, the future old, and what Mark Friedman calls the midlife chasm. In the current old, we can look at lifestyle modifications to improve health, strengthen the social connections to avoid isolation and loneliness, and to keep active by exploring second careers instead of retiring. That's important that older people remain active. For those in the midlife chasm, it is worthwhile to look at some of the novel age retardation strategies which will be discussed extensively during this conference. Many are not yet fully proven in humans, but we need to start somewhere, and the time is now. Again, lifestyle modifications, although difficult to sustain, has a very important role in this phase of life as well. And they should plan not to retire, but to transition to a second or third career, even if it's unpaid, to remain active in their later years. And for the future old, this is where we really need to invest. We need to start optimizing their health and human potential in early life by enhancing their lifestyle patterns, and very importantly, the executive functions, as this has been proven to enable people to plan better, to be disciplined, stay healthy, and be successful. At the same time, we need to expose them to a broad base of learning and instill in them natural curiosity so that they can continue learning and relearning throughout their lives to adapt to our fast-changing world. And finally, we should focus on people of reproductive age, as their health and well-being will determine that of the next generation. For us to get any kind of dividend, we need to first invest. We need to be active shareholders of healthy longevity in order to unlock the longevity dividend. So what should we invest for the biggest impact? Number one, awareness. We need people to change their thinking about aging, that biological aging is mutable, unlike chronological age. And importantly, we should try to outlaw ageism. The next, of course, we also should start planning for a longer life and to consider multiple careers in our lifetime rather than just one. Two is we have to invest in the future old. We should start before people are even born, so preconception, during pregnancy, and in the early years of life, so that we can give everyone the best start to life. And as I said earlier, we should focus on the people of reproductive age, both men and women, especially women, to ensure that the next generation is healthy and is set for a long life that is healthy. Third, I would invest in biomarkers of aging. The incidence of stroke and heart attacks have dropped around the world, mainly because people are taking, not mainly because, but one of the reasons is the use of statins. And statins target lipid levels in the blood. But over time, and it does it very fast, in a few months, if you can find the same biomarkers of aging that you can alter in a few months, in the long run, like statins, you actually alter the course of aging. So, and this is not just for academics, so they can do their studies, but also for industry. Importantly also, we have, consumers may want to check on their own well-being and how they're doing in terms of aging. And so biomarkers can also have a nice big market as a consumer product for them to actually test, see where they are. And finally, we should consider to go beyond conventional biomarkers to biological biomarkers and maybe even digital biomarkers. And very importantly, we have to invest in prevention, starting with nutrition, sleep, physical activity, not only when you're older, but throughout your life course. We have to look at possibly nutritional supplements, and very importantly, repurposed, reformulated drugs. And finally, probably for me as an academic, one of the most important things is research in humans. There's no doubt that we can alter the course of aging in animals. There's a lot of evidence there, but we need to really move to humans. And the reason why we haven't done so is mainly because of the conservatism of the medical community and the research funders who cannot believe that aging can be altered. And I think we have a lot of people here today who will tell you the converse. And along with that, we have to do the necessary studies, not only in older people, but the younger people. We need to do direct comparisons, and we have to take new approaches, including N-of-1 approaches, to see what the best dosing of this and combination of these drugs are going to be. I want to thank Andrea Meyer for showing me this paper published in PLOS Medicine in February this year from a Norwegian group that showed that just simply altering your diet can extend your lifespan by a good 8 to 9 years, even at the age of 60, and about 3 years to 4 years at the age of 80. So if you, and both in men and women, and if you, and simply, not simply, but if you get a diet that is more legumes, whole grains, and nuts, no vegetables and fruit mentioned, I mean mainly legumes, whole grains, and nuts, as well as reducing the intake of red meat and processed meats, you can have significant gains in life expectancy, even at the age of 80 years. So it's not too late to change diet to alter your lifespan. And there's also an immense opportunity to target aging through the reformulating and repurposing of FDA-approved drugs. Many of these drugs have been shown to improve lifespan and healthspan in animals. On top of that, they are known to be safe in humans. So what are we waiting for, right? So we should really be doing the studies. I mean, I wouldn't recommend anybody to start taking these drugs on their own, but we should do the studies that can prove that they work and that they are safe. So the school is the perfect place to test out new approaches to increase health span, and we are pleased to be hacking aging together with the Centre for Healthy Longevity, thanks to the generous gift of $5 million from the Land Foundation for this project. The 3 broad research teams under this initiative looks at testing of novel nutritional supplements and repurposing drugs to slow aging in adults, middle-aged adults, personalizing nutritional supplements and repurposed drugs for optimal health span, and extending health span in older adults through lifestyle interventions, especially physical exercise. Alongside these initiatives, we also have the opportunity to advance the identification of novel biomarkers related to healthy aging and study age-related diseases more intensively, thanks to Mr. Leonardo Drago and Ms. Antonio Hui's kind gift. So these are some recent papers on, again, on animal models. I think it's time we move to humans and put human studies on the front page of Science and Cell and Nature. So I very much look forward to the new discoveries and ideas that can help people all around the world live long, healthy lives emerging from this conference, which brings together an absolutely stellar cast of all the world's thought leaders in the field of healthy longevity. So live long and prosper.
Thank you so much, Professor Chong, our Dean of the school. The next speech and the next speaker will be Mr. Li Po-Hua, who is the CEO of the Land Foundation. I read an interview, and that interview is from 2018, stating that philanthropy is problem solving. So that's what we try to do together. And then I looked again, of course, yesterday night at the Land Foundation website, do that. It's so inspiring, it's sparkling, it's so new, it's refreshing. So, and that's what I feel what we do with the Land Foundation. So thank you so much, Mr. Lee, for giving us the chance to do what we want to do, and that's improving health span. The floor is yours.
Very good morning, DPM Heng, Professor Yo, Professor Chong, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues. It is exciting to see the pace of progress in the global longevity science sector since embarking on our project with Brian Kennedy in 2020. In the past few years, the ecosystem has evolved and strengthened. Sizable investment have been made from the ranks of billionaires to big governments to attract talent and foster innovation. These include Altos Lab, launched this year with $3 billion in funding and a focus on biological reprogramming. It has 4 Nobel laureates on its board. Big Pharma is also in the game. Genentech is looking at regenerative therapies to restore function in diseased tissue. Hevolution Foundation, founded by the Saudi royal family, is doubling down its efforts to slow the aging process. It will spend $1 billion a year in an audacious undertaking that aims to put Saudi on the map of extending health span. Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin has contributed more than 300 million in longevity research. Scientific communities are being built on the blockchain, a new world of decentralized science. NFTs, DAOs, is challenging the current models of research funding, intellectual property ownership, and collaboration and data sharing. VitaDAO, in fact, is one of the first smart contract-based organizations that's engaging longevity science. So big tech like Apple, Amazon, and Alibaba, they are building healthcare platforms and venturing into life sciences. Having amassed a treasure trove of data, they are poised to reinvent the healthcare experience. Recently, Chinese company ByteDance, they are the owners of TikTok. They invested in a biotech startup that harnesses AI and Nobel Prize-winning technology for imaging molecules. So their intent is to revolutionize drug discovery. So it is estimated that the global investment in longevity-focused startup will reach, in fact, it will reach more than 40 billion last year. According to the Bank of America, this market could be worth more than 600 billion by 2025. COVID-19 is a wake-up call, reminding us that disease discriminates by age. It aggravates and complicates the many challenges that our seniors face. Modern medicine is great at keeping sick people alive, but not so much at treating age-related diseases. Maintaining status quo is not only unacceptable, but financially unsustainable. Social economic factors such as income, education, social support are often at the root of health inequalities. These social determinants of health can influence our health span profoundly. So as a society, we have a duty to ensure that anti-aging therapeutics are not confined to the realm of the rich and exacerbate existing disparities. Our work at the Foundation has focused mainly on managing aging and finding new models of care. It is incremental and not creating enough possibilities to get to the root of the problem. So we hope to contribute to the national agenda of shifting the paradigm from the present state of reactive sick care towards a population health prevention approach. The Hacking Aging Initiative will support the Centre's aim to develop biomarkers and interventions that are accessible to all in the community. This is necessary to democratize healthy longevity. About 8 years ago, the Foundation started Gym Tonic. It sounds like an alcoholic drink, but it's actually a network of community gyms that are safe and simple to use for seniors to combat frailty. It is available in 29 locations with over 3,600 active users, of which 140 of them are 90 years and above, including 9 centenarians. So we have 1 gentleman and 8 ladies. Again, another data point to contribute to the open secret that man has always been the weaker sex. So the gym doubles up as a social club where they draw support. People who are younger psychologically and have a sense of purpose tends to live longer. Societies want to cure men of their old habits and reform their will in accordance with good sense and science. But fallible human beings, all of us, we violate all the laws of logic and rationality. So how many of us are able to get our parents or patients to effectively modify their lifestyles? Why do we see the doctor? It's not always because we are sick. Sometimes we are worried and need a reassurance or just someone to complain to. So our conscious and unconscious motivations, our emotions, drive our behavior. So as we shift our healthcare system, we need to see the person as a meaning-making, meaning-seeking individual whose life is less a scorecard, more a story. So let me offer 3 suggestions on what we can improve in Singapore. Firstly, we need to advance longevity science awareness. It needs greater media exposure to change societal attitudes and beliefs on aging. And more importantly, overcome clinical orthodoxy. I recall a conversation with Andrea, who shared an observation that in the Netherlands, most Dutch people know what senescence is, while in Australia, media interest is mostly in nursing homes matters. Singapore, age-friendly narrative is closer to Australia than Netherlands, so I think we need to modulate that narrative. Secondly, we need to rethink the economics of health. Health research and funding typically goes mainly towards diseases rather than increasing health span. We got to recognize that the biology of aging interacts and impacts the biology of diseases. So perhaps the government can consider setting aside a portion of the health budget for translational geroscience, funding clinical trials, and solutions in the community. I'm all with Yap Sing in terms of the suggestion. The regulatory toolkit should also evolve to facilitate the advancement of therapeutics belonging to this category. And thirdly, we need a life course approach to improving health span throughout life, not just old age. So the NUHS Medical School, led by Yap Sing, has the foresight and leadership to establish new areas of collaboration, from extending female reproductive longevity to improving the quality of birth as well as maternal and child outcomes. While at different ends of life spectrum, they essentially share similar values. Another example is in relation to chronic diseases. A growing body of research suggests that their treatment, such as chemo or radiation therapy for cancer, can accelerate biological aging. In fact, childhood cancer survivors are noted to develop twice the burden of disease by age 45, twice the burden. Can rehabilitation, prehabilitation, and health span strategies be incorporated into their treatment program? Let me conclude. From the pandemic, there was a reckoning of health as a national asset, and government investment fueled growth in the biotech and healthcare industries. Healthy longevity is a grand challenge that requires a similar strategy. Cities that prioritize population health span and the longevity economy will become the health and wealth hubs of the future, attracting global talent and investment. National Research Foundation's vision is to make Singapore a leading hub that transforms and protect health, advance human potential, and create economic value. This has to be complemented by an imperative to reduce health inequity and prevent extreme human suffering. Progress is not just about narrowing gap, but the courage to open new doors of possibility. There's something we all have in this room, and that's the courage and the unshakable commitment to build a better future that is shaped by science, technology, and empathy. So my appreciation goes to NUS and NUHS for this learning journey and the opportunity to embrace our human potential. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I would like to invite Professor Chong, our Dean, to the stage to present an appreciation, a token of appreciation. Both stay? Yes, on the stage. Thank you so much. And I would like to invite now Leonardo Drago, who is the Chief Investment Officer in Wells Partners Private Limited. And thank you so much supporting also the Centre for Healthy Longevity, and of course also Antonio Hui. Thank you so much. And now I would like to invite Dr. Jiaming Go to the stage, because now it happens.
Thank you, Andrea. We have a little segment that is specially for you. May I please invite DPN Heng to be on stage as well, and also Prof Kay Guan to also be on stage, and finally Prof Brian Kennedy. Yes, actually, this is going to be an interesting segment. What you see here is an hourglass, and then we're going to have a tug of war. Just kidding. We'll invite the gentleman to actually pull on the ribbons together. And lady. What we are doing now is actually the launch for the Centre for Healthy Longevity. Okay, and this needs also a little bit of the audience participation. I'll need you guys to count down with me, okay? May we please have the countdown? Please start the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and please pull. So the significance of this hourglass actually represents time. But the Centre for Healthy Longevity wants to reverse time, or reverse biological age. Thank you very much. You may actually step off the podium. Can I please invite Mr. Lee to be off stage? Brian Kennedy, the Dean. And can I please ask Prof Kay Guan to stay on stage and Mr. Leo Drago to be off stage. We will now present a gift of appreciation to DPN Heng. So you can see the same facade, but there's going to be a little bit of a modification. This is actually the East Coast facade as well. So Mr. Heng is actually the Member of Parliament for East Coast constituency. Thank you very much, DPN Heng. Thank you very much, Prof CE. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Prof Brian Kennedy, Center Director for the Centre for Healthy Longevity, to kick off the events for today.
Thanks, Jiaming. You know, Jiaming has sort of been with us from the start in trying to get this aging program off the ground. And so it's been really an essential component to what we're trying to do. So we should thank Jiaming as well. Mr. Heng Kwat, Deputy Prime Minister, Li Po-wah, Chung Yum-sing, Dean of the Medical School, and distinguished guests and colleagues. I just want to tell you a little bit about today, what we're doing in terms of preclinical research. So we're going to spend the morning on preclinical studies, and I have some great speakers for that. So I'll try to keep my talk relatively short. And then we'll move on to clinical research in the afternoon. So I hope you can stay with us all day. I think that healthy longevity requires both sides of this coin. And so hopefully we can keep you informed as to that. I think that I want to tell you a little bit about our translational studies today. And I think you've already heard that life expectancy is changing quite rapidly. The change in life expectancy, so what you're looking at is the difference between 7% of the population over the age of 65 and 14%. And countries like France, and some of the European countries have changed quite slowly over time. So there was a lot of time for society and culture to adapt to an older population. But as you can see over to the right, many of the countries, sorry, my slides are moving on their own. Let's see if I can go back. Many of the countries in Asia and in Southeast Asia, including Singapore, are rapidly changing their demography. And so there's not the time to adapt to this population change. And I think that that makes it ever more important that we think about healthy longevity. What can we do now to keep an older population vital, functional, and disease-free? You can see here in these graphs that the cost of aging depends on how healthy the person is. If someone has no chronic diseases over the age of 60, their healthcare costs are very similar to the rest of the population. If they have 2 or more chronic diseases, their healthcare costs go up by about 6-fold. And the panel on the left, which may be hard to see, the table indicates that while life expectancy is going up in Singapore, also the time in which you have disease is going up. And that's what we need to focus on. If we continue doing only a sick care approach, then we're going to extend lifespan, but we're also going to extend the period that people have diseases and have morbidity. If we can couple treating diseases with preventing diseases and targeting aging, then we'll extend health span at the same level or even faster than life expectancy. And that's the way to achieve the best quality of life victory and also the way to achieve the best economic victory. So this is a win-win situation. We just have to implement it. Previously, and I think we've alluded to this before, many of the other talks and also mine, that we've taken a disease-based approach to medicine, both in terms of research, how we fund science, and also in terms of how we treat patients. And yet we know that aging is in fact the biggest risk factor for many of these chronic diseases. I'm looking at Matt because Matt and I have been using this slide for 15 years now. And so it's nice to see that there's so much interest finally in moving this forward. What this means is that if we can target aging, we get the benefit of preventing many, if not all, of the chronic conditions at the same time. You've heard COVID-19 mentioned, and I want to argue that aging is the biggest medical crisis of the 21st century, not COVID-19. And the reason I want to make this argument is that that big bar on the left indicates the biggest risk factor for mortality due to COVID-19. And in fact, that's being over the age of 70. And this is not particularly surprising because it's also the biggest risk factor for mortality due to influenza and many other acute diseases. So really the slide that Matt made or that I made, or we'll have to fight over that later, is limited because we're only talking about chronic diseases. And really what we should be saying is that aging is driving chronic diseases, it's driving functional decline, and it's also driving the response or your resiliency in the face of acute disease and infection. And so this makes it even more important that we target the aging process. And so this is really our approach here. If you look at the top panel, a person has a relatively long life expectancy. They're healthy. That's that green line for a period of time. They start getting sick, and that's when they start getting treated. So we spend a lot of money trying to treat people after they have chronic diseases. And we keep them alive longer, but eventually the diseases become too much and mortality sets in. But what we would like to do is to try the interventions earlier, before we get in the red zone, so that we can extend the green zone. That's really the way to enhance the healthcare of the population most significantly. I think if we do that, we'll not just extend health span, lifespan will go up as well, although probably not at the same pace. And we will also compress morbidity, the period of time in which people are sick and infirm. And so we have not just the Center for Healthy Longevity, which we're talking about today, but the Healthy Longevity Translational Research Program through the Young England School of Medicine. That has a number of great projects, and many of the faculty are here today that you can meet with and talk to. They're listed here. There's a focus not just on aging, but on diseases of aging and specific organ and tissue system aging. And so I would like to encourage everyone to seek out the faculty and talk to them. Also, is Vincenzo Sorrentino here somewhere? Could you stand up just briefly? He's a new faculty member that will be joining our program very soon, so seek him out and ask him about his projects. Thank you, Vincenzo. I want to just briefly talk about the pipeline of research we're doing in the program. So we're combining preclinical or basic science with translational research and clinical research, as well as trying to drive longevity science. And that includes not just communicating science to other scientists, but also to the public, to interested clinicians, and to everyone in Singapore. Because as was mentioned earlier, that we have ways to slow aging now. They're mostly lifestyle approaches, and if we can find ways to get the population to adopt those lifestyle approaches, we can already start to derive benefit. We know a lot about the aging process. Many of the people in the front row here have contributed a lot to understanding how animals age and how humans age over the last 15 years or so. And 2 seminal papers came out describing a lot of that work about 10 years ago now. That research needs to continue. We've identified hallmarks and pillars of aging, but we still don't know how these hallmarks and pillars interact with each other. We're still missing key facets of aging. And so while we want to really focus in the center on trying to validate approaches to extend human health span, it's critical to continue that basic science as well, because there's a lot yet to be learned. And so our preclinical research here really covers a lot of different animal models. In non-vertebrate models like geese, worms, and flies, we're excited to be doing killifish studies now, stem cell models, mice, and also a lot of work in bioinformatics and artificial intelligence. In human studies, we're really interested in understanding biomarkers. So we're trying to not just measure the systemic aging process through biomarkers, but also each of the hallmarks of aging, so that we can understand how specific hallmarks contribute to overall aging in human populations. And we're taking an approach that's very Singapore-centric. We're trying to focus all of our studies on all 3 major ethnicities in Singapore, Chinese, Malay, and Indian. Especially the last 2 ethnicities are highly underrepresented in aging studies. And so we need to understand more about the populations on this island if we want to have the biggest impact. There's no shortage of potential interventions that can work in humans. There's now, if you look at the drug age database, 110 different drugs that have been reported to slow aging in some way in mice. Those ones on the left are things we're working on in the center. I won't go into them in any particular detail, but it's essential to sort through these different approaches, figure out which ones work best in mice for which aspects of aging. And so now we have a project to study aging in mice that's aligned to how we do the human studies. Typically, you would start an intervention, wait 3 years until all the mice are dead, and see if the mice live longer. We're not going to be doing survival studies in humans. We don't have graduate students who want to spend 50 years doing their PhD. And so we need to use biomarkers. So we're doing 6 to 9 month interventions with biomarkers. And we've now adjusted our animal studies to correlate to that. And the hope is that the animal outcomes will be more indicative of what we're going to see in human intervention studies. If I can... these are just some of our results. I'm not going to talk about with different small molecules where we've shown health span extension or lifespan extension in animal models. We're trying to do target ID, understand mechanism, and key on the right is to get these things into clinical studies. All of these natural products and drugs are amenable to human intervention studies, and we need to test them as quickly as possible. This is one of our studies with alpha-ketoglutarate, and I won't go through this slide, but what we showed is that in animals we can reduce frailty by 50%. Imagine if you could do that in a human population. We don't know if it'll work, and that's why we have to do the studies. Rather than show a bunch of slides, I just wanted to show you some mice. If you're a mouse, we've got you covered, by the way. We don't really need to, we can develop population-based interventions now for mice. You can see the mice treated with AKG look quite a lot better than the ones that are aging normally. So I think anyone can see that. And I know which mouse I want to be. But again, this is not enough. We have to get to human studies. We're also doing some more advanced things. We're testing the concept of universal stem cell donors now, so that we've modified, working with a company that's modified stem cells so that they evade the immune system, and we're testing whether we can use those stem cells as factories to produce molecules important for longevity. So there's a lot of more state-of-the-art stuff that goes beyond drugs as well. I just want to close by mentioning that we also have an Asian Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality, which is near and dear to Chong Yup Singh's heart, and he was able to secure a lot of funding for this program. It's to understand ovarian aging, one of the earliest organs that ages, and that not only affects fertility, but it affects long-term health consequences through menopause as well. And so this center is really trying to understand female reproductive aging and how that affects systemic aging. That complements what we're trying to do in these other two programs. And there'll be a conference next week for the Asian Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality Center as well. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us and we can give you the important information about that. We also have a webinar that anyone is welcome to register for. We have a large number of people that watch these shows live on Thursdays at 7 p.m. and they're available on YouTube afterwards. The site there you can look up if you want to register. You can also watch the shows anytime, and we can help you if you can't copy this slide. And so that's all I want to say, except that it's great having Andrea here. That it's really advanced what we're doing clinically and also preclinically, because she doesn't like to admit it, but she knows preclinical science really well in addition. And I listed a lot of the people in my lab and Andrea's lab because not only are they great scientists, but they've done a lot of work to prepare for this conference as well. So I think I'll stop there. Maybe rather than take questions, I can move on and introduce Matt Kaberlein, since we're running slightly behind. Yeah. Should do that now. Okay, we have a last-minute photograph taking to do first. So,
may we please invite DPN Heng, Prof Yo and Prof Chong Yup Singh, and also Mr. Lee Po Mr. Leo Drago and Prof Andre Meyer back on stage. We want to capture another photograph of them with the balloons and the hourglass. Thank you very much. You may take your seats.
All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Kaberlein, who got his PhD from MIT in Leonard Garanti's lab. Matt and I actually got our PhDs in the same lab, and so we've known each other for a long, long time. I think it's fair to say we've been partners in crime. We've probably published 50 papers together, but Matt's published a lot of other papers too, and some of those are good, so you should take him seriously. The great thing about Matt has been that, we worked a lot together over the years, including sitting in the same room dissecting yeast cells for a few years. And I don't think we've ever agreed with each other, but I also don't think we've ever had an argument or fought with each other. So we've always been able to work together and improve each other's science. And so it's a great pleasure to have Matt here. He's a professor of lab medicine and pathology at the University of Washington, and he'll be telling us a little bit about his views on aging. Thanks, Matt.
Well, thank you, Brian. And I do want to thank Andrea and Brian for the invitation to come participate in what is really a very special day. I have to say, I've been quite inspired by the talks that I've heard already this morning. I've been working in this field for 20 plus years now. It's so fantastic to see the progress that we've made in understanding the biology of aging, and maybe more importantly, how the geroscience concept is really starting to become mainstream. And that I think is just wonderful for me to experience and be part of. So, what I hope to do today is to reinforce some of the ideas that we've already heard about the biology of aging, why it's important, talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that I see for the field, and also some of the potential roadblocks and things that I think probably need to happen in order for geroscience, translational geroscience in particular, to achieve the possibilities. So I want to start again with an idea that has already come up several times today, which is that traditional medicine has really been focused around diseases and individual diseases, and often that focus has been on waiting until somebody is sick and then trying to cure their disease, which in many cases really becomes trying to alleviate the symptoms. And I think we need to shift away from that approach to medicine, and think about, what are really the biggest risk factors for these diseases. And again, as we've heard about, we've got some common risk factors that we think about. So I think it's useful actually to look at numbers sometimes. So this is based on data from the United States CDC, looking at some of the common risk factors for 4 of the top 10 killers in the United States. So it turns out, this is 2020 data actually that this is based on. So it turns out that the top 2 killers in the United States are heart disease and cancer. In 2020, the 3rd greatest killer in the United States was COVID-19, which is pretty shocking to think about. And then Alzheimer's disease and other dementias is just a little bit further down the list. So if you think about the common risk factors that if you go to your primary care physician that they will usually associate with these diseases, it's things like, do you smoke? Are you obese? How much do you exercise? And it's useful to appreciate what is the actual relative risk associated with these risk factors. And typically it's on the order of 1 to 2-fold. Okay, so that's about the magnitude of effect of these risk factors for these different diseases. For Alzheimer's disease, ApoE4 is the greatest genetic risk factor, and that's a little bit higher. It's between 4 and 5-fold increase in risk of Alzheimer's disease if you're ApoE4 homozygous. So those are the risk factors that almost everybody who's not already part of the geroscience community will think about. So then you can ask, well, what is the impact of age on risk for these diseases? And if you look at just the change in risk going from 45 to 85, this is now on exactly the same scale. That's the risk of 40 years of biological age, and it dwarfs these other risk factors by an order of magnitude, right? So again, I think it's important to appreciate age. It really is the greatest risk factor for all of these different diseases that we spend so much of our time and resources as a medical community trying to combat. So why is it that we don't think about age as the greatest risk factor from a medical perspective, or at least most people don't, for these diseases? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's only been relatively recently that we really have an opportunity to modify the biological aging process in humans. So again, I mentioned I've been working in the field for more than 20 years. I would say 20 years ago, even the people who were at the sort of forefront of research in this field weren't yet willing to say that what we understood about the biology of aging then was directly applicable to the biology of aging in humans, certainly from an interventional perspective. That has changed completely. We are now on the cusp of a paradigm shift in medicine where some of these interventions we know can have an impact on biological aging in people. And of course, the promise of that is if we can target that biology of aging, we can delay the onset and progression of all of these different diseases. And my slide has animations, unlike Brian's, so I'm gonna say my version is better. So this is really the promise of 21st century medicine. That's how I refer to this paradigm shift towards translational geroscience, to really keep people healthier longer by targeting that biology of aging. And of course, that couldn't happen if we didn't understand a lot more about the biology of aging. So again, you'll probably see the hallmarks of aging slide multiple times today. I think this is the second or third time we've already seen it. And I'm not going to go through the hallmarks of aging. I just show this to emphasize the point that we have learned a lot in the last 20 years. And as Brian said, I think it's important to appreciate we haven't learned everything. So there are other aspects of the biology of aging that go beyond the hallmarks, I believe. But because we now have these conserved molecular processes that seem to be fundamental to the biology of aging, we know what they are to some extent. In principle, we can target those things directly with therapeutics to have an impact on health span and lifespan. And we know we can do that in laboratory animals. Again, this is now pretty routine to significantly delay the biological aging process in laboratory animals, increase lifespan by 10, 20, sometimes 30%, and even more dramatically increase health span. And I think it's all because of what we've learned about the basic biology of aging over the last couple of decades. Okay, so you've already seen a list from Brian of some of the interventions that are, popular in the field right now. There are genetic approaches that we can target to increase lifespan and health span in preclinical studies. There are environmental approaches, and I would put the environmental approaches in two categories, right? There are sort of the lifestyle approaches, and then there are pharmacological approaches or small molecule approaches. Again, I don't think it's useful necessarily to go through this list and talk about each specific intervention. In fact, I think many of the interventions on this list, we have other speakers today who can do a much more credible job of telling you about those interventions than I can. Some of these, though, we already know have an impact on healthy aging in people, right? Exercise, I would argue, is probably the most potent healthy aging intervention that we have right now. Nutritional strategies, we know, can have an impact on healthy life expectancy in people. And I think we're going to learn from some of the studies that will happen right here over the next several years about some of these other interventions, small molecule interventions, and their impact on biological aging in people. And I'm extremely optimistic that several of these can have positive impacts on healthy longevity in people. I am going to briefly allude to rapamycin, because that's one of the interventions that I study quite a bit in my lab, and nobody else is going to talk about it today, so I'll just mention that rapamycin is particularly exciting to me because it works in every animal where it's ever been tested. It's a specific inhibitor of mTOR, which is the mechanistic target of rapamycin. I would argue it is the most robust and reproducible pharmacological intervention for increasing healthy lifespan in laboratory animals and in mice in particular. And it seems to work broadly across most, maybe all, organs and tissues to delay, or in some cases actually even reverse the functional declines that go along with aging. One of the reasons why I'm so excited about rapamycin is because we know a lot about rapamycin use in people because it has been FDA approved for more than 20 years. And this gets to this idea of repurposing known drugs. And I think there's accumulating data that rapamycin probably can have positive impacts on health span in humans as well. So one of the big messages I want to leave you with is that I really believe that now is the time to bring 21st century medicine out of the laboratory and into the real world. And I think there are lots of different approaches that we can take to do that. I want to mention, we've talked a lot, we've heard a lot about how human clinical trials are important. I think companion animal clinical trials have a big role to play here as well. And I get grief sometimes from people because they say, you can't call a companion animal trial a clinical trial. Veterinary clinics are clinics too. And you may not know this, but the Food and Drug Administration in the United States regulates veterinary medicine very similar to the way that human medicines are regulated. There's a branch of FDA called the Center for Veterinary Medicine that regulates approval of drugs. You can get FDA approval of an intervention for treating health in companion animals. And so I think this is a real area of opportunity that we should not ignore because, as probably all of you know, pet dogs, pet cats age much more quickly than people do. Pet dogs age about 7 to 10 times faster than humans do. That's important because we can actually do clinical trials to determine whether or not these interventions that we think might have an impact on healthy aging in people actually have an impact on healthy aging in companion animals about 7 to 10 times faster. We can actually do a lifespan study where lifespan is the primary endpoint in companion animals. And in fact, I'm involved in one clinical trial in companion dogs of rapamycin right now, where lifespan is our primary endpoint. It's part of a project called the Dog Aging Project. The Dog Aging Project is a large longitudinal study of aging. We have about 40,000 dogs in the United States enrolled in the Dog Aging Project. A subset of those dogs are in this clinical trial, so 580 dogs, half placebo, half rapamycin. It's double-blind, randomized clinical trial. And I'm telling you this because at that size, in the cohort that we've got, over a 3-year period, we are statistically powered to detect a 9% change in lifespan. It's just not feasible to do a study like that in humans, or at least in healthy people, to look at whether or not your intervention can impact lifespan. Of course, we're looking broadly at secondary endpoints that we believe will also reflect health span. But really, it's an opportunity to determine whether or not this drug that's robust and able to increase lifespan in laboratory animals can actually have an effect in the real world. And of course, people love their pets, and so there is an impact on quality of life for the owners as well. And that turns out is my dog. His name is Dobby. And so I think it's just a real opportunity to help bring geroscience into the mainstream in a way that may not be possible through other kinds of studies. And then, of course, there's human clinical trials, and we've heard about some of the exciting things that are happening here in Singapore. There are clinical trials, of course, happening around the world that are now starting to apply geroscience interventions and determine whether or not it's possible to have an impact on healthy aging in humans. And I would say, again, I think we know enough now, certainly, that it should be possible to increase healthy lifespan in people by 7 years. That's at the low end. I think lifestyle interventions alone can probably do that for most people. And on the high end, I would say we probably know enough today that for some people, we could have an impact of getting close to 2 decades on healthy lifespan. That's speculative, certainly, but I think probably most of my colleagues would agree with that we are really on the cusp of having the opportunity to have big impacts on healthy longevity in humans. And of course, with the resources that are coming into the field, those discoveries are going to accelerate, right? So I think that the potential is there if we can keep people healthy for an extra 5, 10, 15 years to then apply new discoveries that are coming down the pipeline. Okay, so how are we going to achieve this? I think these are just some ideas for I think things that need to happen. So obviously we need well-powered clinical trials for prevention of age-related disease. And I just want to reinforce, this is fundamentally different, right, than the approach of most clinical trials, right, which are in sick people who are already sick, usually trying to keep them alive. This is about keeping people healthy rather than treating their disease. I think, it's certainly, we still have a lot of work to do in educating the medical community about targeting the biology of aging, about geroscience, and particularly that the biology of aging is modifiable. Probably in this room, most of you already accept that, although I would suspect there's probably several people in this room who are still a little bit skeptical. And I think we've made a lot of progress in educating the clinical community, the general public, regulators, that aging is modifiable, but we have a lot of work still to do because I think, this is still early days in terms of getting the message out. And I just wanted to mention, I talked about rapamycin. So there are actually several clinical trials that are happening now with respect to rapamycin, or will be happening this year. And I showed 4 of these because I think they reflect the breadth of potential endpoints that we can think about for geroscience clinical trials. Oral health is something that we've studied in my lab. It's not a typical place that most people who are doing clinical trials would think to start, but I think there are real opportunities looking at periodontal disease and oral health, and there's a study by John Ahn at the University of Washington looking at rapamycin's effects on oral health. We heard a little bit about reproductive aging and female reproductive aging. This is another place that's emerging as an opportunity to do clinical trials and actually see changes in the endpoints in a relatively short period of time. And there's a study out of Columbia for the effects of rapamycin on premature ovarian failure in women. Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment, there are multiple studies that are starting up with respect to rapamycin, one out of University of San Antonio, Texas Health Science Center. And then exercise and muscle function, I think, is an important area where there's also a clinical trial happening. And again, this is not an extensive list. We'll probably hear from Jim Kirkland about many clinical trials for senolytics. We'll hear from Nir about the targeting aging with metformin clinical trial, which is a little bit different model. This is really just to give you an idea of the breadth of endpoints that it's possible to look at from the geroscience approach. Okay, so I come back to the need to educate physicians and regulators and the general public. I think another thing that is going to be critically important, and we'll hear a couple of talks today about biomarkers and aging clocks. I think we've made, again, a lot of progress in developing biomarkers that we think reflect biological age. There's no question that these biomarkers, like the epigenetic clocks, can be quite precise at measuring chronological age. And I think there's growing optimism that we can use these tools to measure biological age. Probably most important from the intervention, development, and validation perspective, we need biomarkers that can measure the pace of biological age, so the rate of aging. And I think those are still in development. But this is going to be, critically important going forward for rapidly being able to assess whether an intervention has an impact on aging in people, and probably most importantly, for personalizing those interventions. And I think that's an area where there's growing recognition that different people have different aging trajectories, and the same interventions to optimize healthy longevity for me may not work for you. I think nutrition is a place where we can all sort of immediately appreciate this, right? The optimal diet for me is going to be very different from the optimal diet for Brian, I'm guessing. But we need biomarkers to really tell us, which diet is optimal for each individual. And so I think we're seeing a lot of progress there, but there's a lot of work to be done as well. And then I think we need to have continued robust support for basic research. As Brian and I both alluded to, there's a lot of work still to be done fundamentally to understand the biology of aging. But we also need robust support for longevity biotechnology. And I think, it's been exciting to see the growth of the longevity biotechnology community over the last couple of years. We need that in order for these interventions to come out of the laboratory and actually get into the pipeline for approval and ultimate clinical use in humans, and for development of what I would call next generation longevity interventions. And I just want to mention briefly one foray into the longevity biotechnology pipeline. This is a company that has a Singapore connection. This is a company that developed technology out of my lab. It's called Aura Biomedical. You'll see Brian and Jan Gruber are co-founders with myself. And really the goal of this company is to accelerate the development and discovery of longevity interventions. The guys on the team like the tagline, building the future of preventative medicine. I really prefer the tagline, building an army of robots to defeat aging. And that's really the goal of our company, is to take a high throughput robotic pipeline that we've developed that allows us to do tens of thousands of longevity intervention experiments rapidly. And we couple that with artificial intelligence to analyze the data and predict drugs or identify drugs that can have significant impacts on longevity. So this is a system called the WormBot. And we believe that within a year and a half, we should be able to scale this up so that we can do 100,000 longevity intervention discovery experiments a year. And just to give you a little bit of context, that's probably an order of magnitude beyond the rest of the field combined for lifespan studies in C. elegans. So this is potentially a real game changer in terms of the very early stage pipeline and small molecule discovery for longevity. And I just want to mention, one of the great things you can do when you can do intervention discovery at this scale is explore places that nobody else is looking. So this is very preliminary data that we've developed using the WormBot on combinatorial interactions. And I don't want to go into any depth here except to say the biggest bar there, so this is the percent effect on lifespan in these experiments. The biggest bar is combining two molecules, one of them being metformin, the other being a different FDA-approved drug. So this was just a process of screening across the library. And what you're seeing here are interactions that look truly synergistic. What I mean by that is the effect of the two molecules together is much greater than what you would expect, even just adding the two single drugs alone. And so I think that these are the kinds of potentially big, game-changing interventional discoveries that we can find if we can scale up to the point where we can really do unbiased high-throughput screening. So it's very exciting, and you probably can't see the axis there, but the one farthest on the right, that's about a 2.5-fold increase in survival from combining two molecules, so much greater than the effect of the interventions that we think about currently in the field. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with just this last message, which is that, again, I said I really believe we're on the cusp of a paradigm shift in healthcare. Longevity research is clearly permeating other areas of biomedicine. It's exciting to see people working on cancer and heart disease, studying things like senescent cells. They may not even realize that they're studying the biology of aging, but they're actually taking lessons that we've learned from geroscience and applying it to their disease models. We've already heard that there has been a pretty dramatic increase in funding for geroscience research, both in the nonprofit realm and in the private sector. Hevolution Foundation, I'm sure Felipe will talk a little bit about in just a few minutes. We heard about Altos putting $3 billion into their private sector endeavor. Many smaller initiatives and influxes of money into longevity biotech. And it's really been exciting to see how the longevity biotech sector is exploding in the last couple of years. There have been literally dozens of companies started in the last couple of years focused specifically on longevity biotechnology. I alluded to the fact there are many geroscience clinical trials already underway for diverse endpoints, and we're seeing the rapid growth of clinics that want to get into this area. And I think one of the important things that the Longevity Medicine Society can do is really help standardize the approaches that are being taken. And we really want to I want to add a note of caution as we have a lot of clinics moving into the longevity medicine space. We want to do everything we can to make sure and help those clinics apply real science-based and evidence-based approaches to longevity, because that hasn't always been the case in the past. Okay, so with that, I will stop, and thank you for your attention.
So I think we have time for maybe a question from the audience. Any questions? Here, Yvonne. Let me see if I can reach over and just give you the mic. It's coming there.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Matt, for the wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you about rapamycin and the mTOR pathway. I've heard and read that sort of in people of a more athletic disposition, that can have an impact on ATP production, sort of at peak rates. I don't know if that gets too technical, but I wondered, is there any substance to that, and should we be taking that into consideration?
Sure. So first thing I'd say is there aren't any great studies, right? So this is one of the challenges with applying the preclinical data and trying to translate it to humans, right? We really don't have great data in humans. One thing I would say is within the muscle biology community, we know that mTOR activation is required for muscle biosynthesis. And so there has been a perception that if you're inhibiting mTOR with rapamycin, that you could have a negative impact on muscle growth. The actual data in laboratory animals is that you preserve muscle function, muscle mass, muscle strength during aging with rapamycin. Now, in people who are healthy and very active, we just don't have any data. My perception from collecting information from people who are using rapamycin off-label, there's no evidence that it has a detrimental effect on muscle maintenance or muscle growth if you are doing resistance training. I would just say, you know, it's really hard to know for sure in the absence of clinical trials.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks. I think maybe we should move on.
Okay,
Matt
thanks.
will be here all day. Don't leave the stage, Matt. We have a major gift here for you, so don't spend it all in one place. So I wanted to say just a couple things. One thing is that I forgot to mention Kagwan earlier during my talk. And starting the Center of Excellence has been and having the foresight to allow us to do something on the healthy longevity has been something that's really allowed the research to move forward here. And so we've mentioned Yap Singh's role before. I also want a round of applause for Kagwan. I'd like to please ask you to remain seated for a couple seconds because Deputy Prime Minister Heng will be taking his leave. Thank you very much for coming and attending the talks today, and I'm glad that you're so interested in healthy longevity. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker is Felipe Sierra. He got his PhD in University of Florida. I didn't actually know that, and so I learned something new today. Everybody knows Felipe for being the director of the Division of Aging Biology at the National Institute of Aging, and so that means that most of us scientists coming from the U.S. have called up Felipe numerous times to say, I can't believe your review panel didn't like my grant. And so he's been kind enough to put up with that. But also, I think Felipe left a big legacy at the National Institute of Aging where he's left recently because he really pushed geroscience to the forefront. And not only did he get the NIA to pay more attention to geroscience, but he managed to get all of the other institutes at the National Institutes of Health to pay attention as well, and that's a big job. So I want to recognize him for that. He's now moved on, and you're Chief Scientific Officer, right, of Hevolution, which you've heard mentioned earlier. This is an effort to really kickstart longevity research, a large amount of money devoted to funding geroscience and aging, and he may tell us a little bit about that. So without further ado, Felipe, I would like to invite you to the stage.
Thanks, Brian. I will not be talking about evolution because I was given a talk. I was given a title for my presentation, and that's Hallmarks of Aging and a Geroscience Approach to Health. So actually, we'll be talking about science. So this is how you move the slides? How? Like this? No. How do you move the slides? Nobody will tell me? There. Another button. All right. So we have all seen this image before, several times, in fact, but I just want to emphasize something that other people have said, and actually I will say this is, I'll be just reinforcing things that we have already heard. Basically, about a decade ago, there were three things that happened simultaneously, more or less, which really changed the field. One was the advent of geroscience as a concept, as an idea, and there was a publication of two papers, the Hallmarks of Aging on top and the Pillars of Aging in the bottom. I was involved with the second, not the first. I was very heavily involved with geroscience. So those are things that are important. that changed the way we see the field. We felt that we had learned enough that we can start applying these things to humans. But I think at this point what I would like to emphasize is, okay, it has been 10 years. Let's move on. Let's move on from this image that we in the field are all sick and tired of seeing because everybody uses them, okay? So let's move from defining the hallmarks of aging to what can we do with them? And also, how can we put this into the context of helping humans live better? So this is some ideas that I've developed over the last few months that I would like to share with you, and I would certainly like your opinion about them in the break. So, as I say, these two papers were quite seminal. And there has been a lot of discussion about them. Some people don't like them, some people like them, most people like them actually because they have been seminal to moving the field forward. But they say, how come these two papers are not identical? We don't know what we're doing because they came up with different things. Let me just tell you that there were different purposes of these papers, the different developments. One of them was developed in Europe, the other one in the US. Our paper, the one on the pillars of aging, the one that's least used because the image is not as pretty. No, and in reality, we came up with it about a few months later. But anyway, the purpose of ours was simply, I was organizing the very first meeting on geroscience, and I had to develop a program. I have 7 sessions, so I have 7 pillars. It wasn't more than that, right? But the important thing to keep in mind is that they're not so different. So basically, these are the pillars, the hallmarks, in a different order, just that. And let's notice that 3 of them are identical with the ones we have. And the other ones are so closely related. I mean, you can combine, unfortunately, I cannot see from here. Usually look at the slides. But you can combine, for example, damage to DNA with telomeres into one thing, macromolecular damage, and even more like that with proteostasis and so on. So we're not so different between the two papers. We are in agreement within the field about what are the drivers of the process. Now, while doing this, and I was thinking, okay, we need to re-examine what are the hallmarks. And I started collaborating with Rafael De Cabo and Luigi Ferrucci on trying to define new hallmarks of aging or something like that. We came up with, if you see, actually, no, I cannot point at things. Here are 5 things that we thought were important, so we just drew them in a different way, a new set of hallmarks. Other people will have different ideas. These are the ones that I had with Rafa and Luigi. Other people will have different hallmarks. But the important thing is that we keep thinking about how do we envision this thing as time progresses. Now, I have these 5. As I say, other people might have others. You see only the slide, do you? Because actually there are some comments in there. Okay, anyway. The important thing to me is that, okay, this is all well and good to think about different hallmarks, it's academic entertainment, right? But we really have to go beyond that. How are we going to measure them? What are we going to get out of them? So we're very proud in the field because we have been developing these clocks that everybody talks about, and actually some of us are sick of seeing so many clocks. But so we talk about the methylation clock, there's immunology clock, there's proteostasis clock, there's all sorts of clocks. What are we learning? We talk very often about because it was the first one, the epigenetic clock. Well, do we really have a clock of epigenetics? All we're measuring is one variable, methylation of DNA. It turns out that epigenetics is a lot more than that. Do we have a clock for the changes in histone modifications, which happen to change with age as well? And those affect gene expression just as much as the DNA methylation. Do we have for chromatin rearrangements, things like that? And of course, that can be said for each one of these hallmarks. The important thing is that we need to develop how we're going to measure these things now to move forward. And actually, so I want to come back to this figure that you already saw, because probably you didn't realize that I left one thing out. I left this one that appears in the pillars but not in the hallmarks, which is adaptation to stress. Okay, I just had a session called like that, so that's why it's there. But why is adaptation to stress not in the other one? The reason, I think, is because adaptation to stress, we can give it another name, which is resilience. And I happen to believe that loss of resilience is the critical driver of aging. I'm not talking about physiological resilience or psychological resilience, which is very well established and very well studied. I'm talking about molecular resilience. The resilience that every cell in your body has to deploy in order to survive and thrive. Basically, the example that I would like to give is, if you get liver cancer, you're going to get chemotherapy. That chemotherapy is not going to affect just your liver. It's going to affect every cell in your body. The very last cell in the tip of your nose will have to respond to the chemotherapy. Otherwise, it will die, right? And that ability to respond to challenges, to me, is the most critical thing about aging. How well do I respond? In other words, I don't care what my current levels of IL-6 or GDF-15 or anything like that. What are those levels right now? No, what I would like to know is, how good is my capacity to produce IL-6 or GDF-15 when I need to? In other words, when I'm under stress, right? So that's why I think that this is so critical. Now, I will take a minute to talk about one of the few papers that have been attacking the hallmarks of aging. This is a paper by David James and Pedro Macalares. So they wanted to conceptualize the thing, and they argue that in the case of cancer, you have a primary driver which produces the hallmarks, and that leads to disease. And we don't have that on aging, and they call it a crisis. I disagree that we're in a crisis. What happens is that aging is not a disease. It's a risk factor for disease, as we have heard. So basically, maybe there is no primary cause, or maybe there is. In the case of cancer, it's mutations. In the case of aging, it's just entropy. The entropic forces of physics, entropy, is what's leading to damage in the body. And the hallmarks are a way of dealing with that damage. And the result is not a disease, like in the case of cancer, but it is this loss of resilience. As you age, you lose your ability to deal with those challenges, and you lose your resilience, and that, to me, is a central part. So why do I say resilience being the most important thing? Because we have other things that happen with aging. I think the loss of resilience is the driver, because loss of resilience will lead to frailty, will lead to disease, and those two things will lead to death. Now, you can start somewhere else. You can start by frailty. You can start by disease. Indeed, you get a chronic disease, for example, you're going to lose your resilience immediately. But why I put the emphasis on resilience is simply because of timing. If you look at development of diseases, as in this graph, they all increase with age, as we have seen. Aging is the major risk factor, no question about it. Now, if you look at frailty, it happens about that time. One thing that I like to say always is that I am not frail. Okay, I'm 68 years old. I am not frail at all. Okay, I don't have diseases either, fortunately. I am not frail. However, my resilience is not what it used to be, because resilience is something that you lose earlier in life. So I cannot party as I could when I was 30. Or to be more precise, I can still party, but then the next day, Okay, so I'm not frail, but I am loss of resilience. So that's why, as we talk about preventative things, loss of resilience, if we can measure it, and that's the critical thing, we don't know how, but if we could measure it, that would tell us in advance, before we get into trouble, what are our chances of getting in trouble. So to me, when we're trying to join the role of aging into disease, we have been putting a lot of effort into frailty because it's something that has been defined to an extent. But I don't think we're going to get the full picture unless we add resilience. I think resilience will complete the picture because it works before. So how do you use that conceptual thing? So here are the hallmarks of aging again. You can focus on anyone. Let's focus, for example, on cell-senescence. And you can measure how changes in cell-senescence will affect resilience. And therefore, by affecting resilience, affecting your frailty, your risk of disease, and your risk of death. Of course, you can start with cell-senescence, you can start with proteostasis, you can start with whatever you prefer, okay? The important thing is that we need to link these hallmarks, these major drivers of aging, to why aging is the major risk factor. That is the goal. So, and a little bit changing the subject now, but basically the initial goal of geroscience, and this was the very first paper on geroscience, we were trying to link these pillars of aging to disease. That was how we define geroscience. Aging is a major risk factor for chronic diseases, and therefore we should attack aging rather than attack the chronic diseases. I have moved away from that concept a little bit and focused a little bit more away from diseases and into the things that are important for you to live happily. One example I like to give is that we put all of our effort into resolving those diseases that kill us, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. And this is what leads to what Matt and others have talked before. That's why we're increasing lifespan, because we're not dying of what we are supposed to die, but because we got that disease because we're getting old, okay? So we resolve that disease, but because we're getting old, we're getting other diseases. And therefore, our quality of life is going down. Our time with diseases is expanding, or not expanding, but actually going down at a lower rate. We're not paying attention to the diseases that are important for our daily living. I like to give the example that I'm worried about my getting arthritis. Why? Because what I enjoy in life, other than science, is to paint and to play the guitar. What happens if I get arthritis? I won't be able to paint or play the guitar. I will be a very unhappy camper, right? Because I cannot enjoy life. So is cancer or cardiovascular more important than arthritis? The funding would suggest that it is, but that's where I think it's a problem. We need to focus on health and not on diseases, and that's the most important thing. The problem is that we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about health. There have been several attempts. Some of them are in here, like the paper by Lopez-Otin, some ideas that I discussed with Ron Kohansky, Kushel. I will focus a little bit on the intrinsic capacities, which you see on the bottom left. That is the proposal of the World Health Organization, precisely on what are the main drivers of health that allow us to do what we want to do. So there's an importance, for example, in vision, hearing, as well as cognition, mobility, etc. All of those are important. I'm going to be focusing on those because in between the time that I was at the NIH and when I went to evolution, I was working in France on this particular subject. So we can put those things in the same framework that I put the previous one. So basically we have 5 intrinsic capacities, and there are a few things that we can measure on those. Okay, that's the same idea, but now talking about health rather than molecular and cellular drivers. I'm going to draw them in a different way. That's just drawing it in a different way because of building to the next slide, which is basically what we want to do is to see how these things are correlated. We have, in my picture, we had 5 different hallmarks, molecular and cellular hallmarks, and intrinsic capacity. By chance, there's also 5. So we want to know how metabolism affects all of these intrinsic capacities, etc. Or we want to see how cognition affects things back and forth, okay? Okay, that's nice. We can make a few correlations. I'm sure AI people can help us give value to each one and so on. Yeah, okay, great. But when we talk about metabolism, we're not talking about one measurement, as I said. We're talking about multiple. And if you try to draw, I didn't take the time to draw those things because it would take me forever. All of these interactions are important, some more important than others. But there will be somebody in the world studying the relationship between one of them on the left with one of them in the right. And they're going to find a correlation. Everything is correlated. So basically it becomes such a puzzle that it goes beyond our comprehension. That's why artificial intelligence is becoming very important in the field. And then if to all of that, you want to add diseases, wow, that becomes quite a challenge, okay? But I think we should forget about the diseases. I think this is the most important thing that we are seeing in the field right now. We really, really need to put health in the front and not diseases, okay? So what happens that the classical medicine, and again, this has been mentioned by others, classical medicine focuses on the negative things, focuses on all negatives, disease, comorbidities, dependency, okay? So that those are all bad things, and we're focusing on the bad things. Well, let's be a little bit more optimistic and focus on the good things. So geroscience focuses on intrinsic capacity, on resilience, on avoiding frailty, on staying healthy as opposed to getting diseases. So let's focus on health rather than focus on diseases. And I think that that's an important paradigm. I think Matt mentioned that we're on the verge of a big paradigm shift in biomedicine. I think this is the most important part. One of them is that we're going to be focusing on aging as a risk factor, and the other one is we're going to have to focus on health rather than on disease. So, in summary, I'll talk about a few topics, even if you didn't notice that I was changing. So, we talk about the hallmarks. I think they have been a very important thing that these papers provided to the field, a unifying way where everybody feels, okay, this is where I fit within the whole thing. But we need to review the hallmarks. This has to be a live effort that changes constantly. For example, when the hallmarks papers came, we knew basically nothing about the microbiome. Well, we know a lot about it. And a more physiological, how about fibrosis? It's not there. So we need to re-examine those things all the time. And most importantly, we need to develop measurable things about these hallmarks. Then I talk about what I think is the most important topic that we have to develop. What's molecular resilience? How do we define it? It's not so easy to define any sort of resilience. By definition, you have to challenge the system, okay? Because your resilience is your ability to respond to that challenge. So if you don't challenge it, you're not going to measure resilience. But how do we challenge people in all these molecular domains. In other words, we're going to give people chemotherapy and free radicals and heat shock and all of. No, we can't do that, right? So how we're going to measure it? That's still a question to the field. We're not there yet. We don't know how to measure it, but I think it's very important. Then we need to link those things to physiology. One thing is to have the hallmarks at the molecular level, but how do we really relate those to physiology and health? And the last thing, last but not least, the diseases, forget about them. Forget about them, really. They're not important. I usually give a hard time to people. I talk to somebody and say, what do you do? I work on cancer, and I always tease them, why are you waiting on cancer? That's so unimportant. And they look at me like, what? Well, cancer is just one of the things that happens with aging. Why don't you focus on aging, which is a much bigger thing than cancer, right? So let's forget about the diseases. Let's focus on health and change the paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sierra. We have a few minutes for question and answers, so we will take some from the floor. Are there any questions for Dr. Sierra? Yes.
Thank you. Do you think there would be a difference between molecular resilience and cellular resilience?
That's a very good question. I always put molecular cellular together. I think that, the cell is formed of molecules. So the reason I mention both is because things like cellular senescence, for example, is a cellular process driven by molecular changes, the SASP and all of those things. The two things are completely interrelated, because when you change the molecular function of a cell, you're changing the cell. The thing that I was trying to make the difference actually was not so much in between molecular and cellular, as opposed to the molecular cellular resilience, as opposed to the psychological resilience, for example, or things that are more broad body-wise things. In terms of the psychological resilience, there's a lot of studies on that, a lot of studies on how bad conditions when you're a child, for example, affect your later lifespan. What we're missing in that domain, and this is a completely different topic basically, what we're missing in this domain is how do things get transduced? I know that if I grow poor, I'm going to have less health in my age life than if I grow up with money. I'm not going to change that. But if I can figure out how they get transduced, if it's through epigenetics or whatever, then I can possibly erase the bad effects of early childhood events so that they don't affect negatively my late events. So that's a different topic altogether. When I'm emphasizing that I'm talking about molecular and cellular resilience, basically, if you give a cell chemotherapy, how does the cell survive and things like that.
So to therapeutic developers, the regulatory framework is very important. And as it stands now, regulatory framework is very disease-focused.
Yeah.
So do you have any views on how that needs to change in order to enable development and commercialization of health-focused therapeutics instead of disease-focused therapeutics?
Yeah, excellent question, thanks. There is a roadblock in there, indeed. However, the roadblock is not as much as we think in the field. If you talk with people at the FDA, even at the very highest levels, last week I was talking with Ned Sharpless, who used to be there, now he's elsewhere. The block is not there. Their mission is to increase health. And so it's not really focused on disease. This is because the whole field is still completely focused on diseases. It's not their mandate to do like that. And they recognize that, so they say, we're willing to work with you as long as you can show clear biomarkers. And that's why we are so focused on biomarkers. Something that really predicts the loss of function. Now, just to give you an example of why, with the right biomarkers, we don't need to say cold aging a disease, is the example that I think Matt gave of statins, or somebody else did. Statins are not against the disease. They're against the risk factor, okay? They affect your level of cholesterol. That's a risk factor. Hypercholesterolemia, okay, some people call it a disease, but it has no symptoms. The symptom is that you can get something. So there is precedence for the FDA to accept a good biomarker that really predicts disease. Or in our case, we're going to have to work with them, and as I said, they're willing to do it, on focusing on not one disease, but multiple diseases, that this is a risk factor for multiple diseases. It's a work that we have to do. At Evolution, we are planning to do that eventually as well, and it's for the whole community to do.
Thank you. One more question from the gentleman in black.
Thank you for your comments. Similar to the last question, do you think that physicians and the medical system are the right place to begin delivery of a health-based product or service, given the, I would say the price point in medical care is very high, and the incentives, both professional, long-standing, fix what's broken, and sort of thinking, and certainly surgery as a distinct specialty different than medicine and primary care. How should we begin thinking about delivery of health services different than medical services?
Yeah, the problem of this type of approach is not being paid by the medical system. It's a big limitation indeed. So some people are starting, like here, with the clinics that try to get there. Originally, it would have to be paid by the patients, basically. I hate to call them patients because they're not sick. Paid by the individual. Unfortunately, that's the case, but one of the things that we need to do is to democratize everything. That will take time. That will take time, but we're going to have to be patient. But it is a very important thing that we convince people like the FDA, as we were talking before, and other payers, insurance companies, to cover these things. The problem we have, like in the States, for example, is that insurance companies will not pay for a preventative effect that will affect you after you're 65, because after 65, you're covered by Medicare. Medicare will not pay for something that you do when you're 45. So there's a conundrum there. Simply a bureaucratic-based conundrum. But those things, we need to acknowledge them. They are there. They are roadblocks that we have to work on. And that's the job for all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question here.
Thank you. My question is it likely in the future that stem cell infusions could be part of the menu for cell resilience? I know it's not approved, but is that something remotely in the future?
Difficult question, because yes, I think that technically stem cell replacement could be very well become the medicines of the future. Where I'm hesitating is about how we're going to democratize that. For now, stem cell therapy is, of course, extremely expensive, right? So it will only favor a small percentage of the population. So that's something that, again, that we have to deal with. And we come back to what's closest to my heart, which is we always need to come back to basic biology. So stem cells are great. how they work, why are they working, can we find alternatives? And you know, the example, for example, the experiments that came originally from Tom Rando's laboratory about parabiosis, and we're thinking, okay, I'm going to get blood of a young person. Well, you don't have to. You kind of isolate what's there or whatever. You have to find a better way to do something that at the beginning looks very complex, like stem cells, and you have to democratize it. But in terms of the potential for stem cells, yes, I think it's very strong potential for the future. And I assume Tom will agree, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We can take one more question.
Everybody's tired of me.
Maybe one question for you, Dr. Sierra. You mentioned in your last summary slide about the physiological markers of aging, and that's something that is not well known. Would you like to maybe expand a little bit on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there are several attempts. As I mentioned, there's this paper by Lopez Otin, there's the effort from the World Health Organization. How do we find aging? I mean, we did a great job 10 years ago defining aging at the molecular and cellular level. How do you define at the more physiological level? And what are the biomarkers that we should follow? We go to a doctor and we get a lot of things measured. Which ones of those are the most relevant for your actual function? For not just to predict disease, but which ones are important for you to function? And that's why I say, for example, there's an emphasis, for example, on auditive and vision and things like that, which are so important. Now, to put that in context is a little bit difficult sometimes because, for example, I've seen the results of some studies. Well, 95% of people over 65 have problems with vision. Yes, because most people have to wear glasses. And that's the question they ask. Do you wear glasses? Yeah. Oh. No, that's not. You are at the ceiling level where it's not good enough. And that's why another thing that I didn't mention, but I think that is very critical, is that the important thing is not, I mentioned my levels of IL-6 or GDF-15. The important thing is how those change as a function of time. Longitudinal studies are critical because my levels of those things, my ability to see or to hear, can be at different levels for different people, right? The important thing is how fast are they going down? They're going down, yes. How fast? And that's the most important thing. So again, we come back to the thing that longitudinal measurements are more important. And of course, those are more complicated, and then come back to the who's going to pay for them and so on. So it's a complex mix of things.
But a very important question. Thank you very much, Dr. Oh, one more question. We can take just one more question.
You mentioned that stress and psychological trauma affects lifespan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit more, because that's related to loss of resilience as well. So it's a very
So that's a
interesting angle.
A very well defined level of area of research. When I was at the NIA, there was a division of behavior and social research. Okay. And they had shown in millions of studies that if you grow up or you suffer specific stresses in life, that's going to affect your life, your health, right? So basically, the bottom line is, and I mentioned, if you grow up in a household where children are mistreated, okay, they're going to age faster than in a household that's a better environment. My concern with that was always, yes, I know that. And I know it very well. You have shown it to me thousands of times. How do you get from A to B? What is it that changes your physiology when you're young that leads to the bad outcomes when you're old. Okay, so that, as I say, is a different area, and I was trying to emphasize that my focus is on molecular and cellular things that are more intrinsic to your being, rather than those things that are psychological and very modified by so many things, but yet we don't know how they work.
So it's about treatment of the whole body, whole person, not just the body. It's the mind and the body. Right?
Of course, yes. And again, my emphasis was on mind and body, but from the molecular perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the Q&A session, and also for Dr. Sierra's talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Sierra.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, Felipe said that he didn't have a tie, so we thought we would give him something. All right, if you give another talk, we'll give a jacket too. So thanks, Jeremy, for filling in. I think at this point we're going to go to a break, and we'd ask people to come back. It's a little, maybe, what time? In 15 minutes, please. So thank you. Our next speaker is Henry Jasper, who's, I think, is he somewhere? He's there. Okay, so I can introduce him. Just wanted to make sure you weren't running off somewhere. He got his degree from University of Heidelberg in biology, and I've known Henry for a long time too. I recruited him to be Chief Scientific Officer at the Buck Institute, and he's still a professor there. But then he went over to the dark side in Genentech, and he's currently doing a lot of work on stem cells and translational discoveries targeting a range of diseases. But he's thought a lot about aging as well, and so I think he can provide a great perspective on that. Henry, thanks for coming.
Well, thanks, Brian, and thanks also, Andrea, for organizing this symposium, which is really impressive. Yes, I am at Genentech focusing on regenerative medicine, stem cell biology, which really came out of our interest in understanding how aging impacts regenerative capacity. We all have stem cells in our tissues that are and should be, let me see if I can move these slides. I don't get any advancement of slides here. Oh, it's advancing here. Okay. It just took a while. All right. Here we go now. Yeah, these are not in sync. All right. So we all have stem cells in our bodies, and of course, one of the big questions in aging is why do our tissues not properly regenerate anymore as we age? And you could, of course, argue that you can solve a lot of the problems of old age if you were able to actually regenerate tissues just as much as embryos can, where tissues are being formed initially from a lineage of stem cells. And it's actually the fact that in embryos, if you injure an embryo, you actually get regeneration and repair that is often scarless and often almost perfect because the capacity of these tissues to regenerate and to actually form a new organ is really preserved very highly. We lose that capacity with age, and it has been argued in the field that a lot of this loss of regenerative capacity is due to stem cells acquiring properties that allow them to prevent cancer, to prevent getting into a deregulated situation where you would overproliferate, you would damage the tissue by actually causing tumors, and hence mechanisms that are acting as anti-tumor mechanisms are actually also drivers of aging phenotypes in many tissues. So one of the central questions that we've tried to address is how this balance between maintaining regenerative capacity and preventing tumor formation can be managed. Of course, with age, stem cells, just as any other cells, are exposed to a number of different stressors. And that ultimately leads to a decline in regenerative capacity and to an acquisition of these anti-tumor mechanisms. So we need to understand how homeostasis is maintained, and of course, in a translational perspective, how can we modulate stem cell function to improve tissue function and to target age-related diseases. Now, when I talk about stem cells in this way, I'm talking primarily about somatic stem cells, which we have in many of our tissues, and they are somewhat different in different tissues, but as a general rule, they're influenced by a number of intrinsic, local, and systemic parameters that include cell autonomous regulators, like things that control gene expression, things that control the epigenome of these cells, things that control the metabolism. They're also regulated by local niche factors that control the stemness, the ability of these cells to maintain plasticity and give rise to different cell types that are required for the regeneration of the tissue. And they're also influenced, of course, by systemic factors, growth factors, cytokines that will often influence the activation of stem cells from a quiescent state to an active state, and also the differentiation capacity into different daughter cells that are then required for tissue function. With age, all of these things change. You, of course, changes in the systemic environment. You have intrinsic changes that include things like telomere shortening, includes things like DNA damage, as well as you have a loss of niche factors that ultimately lead to a loss of quiescence and a loss of regenerative capacity of these cells. So what I want to do today is give a brief overview of some of the basic work we've done, and then go into, and we've used Drosophila, the Drosophila intestine as a model system to actually understand fundamentally how aging impacts stem cell function. And then I'll talk about a study in which we've recently found a mechanism by which senescent cells, which, as you know, accumulate in aging tissues, influence stem cell behavior. And I'll end with a recent study on in vivo reprogramming, where we're trying to actually turn back the clock and induce plasticity in cells using the famous Yamanaka factors that induce pluripotency. And we're trying to understand whether this could be an intervention strategy for age-related diseases. So as I mentioned, we have used the fly as a model system quite extensively. We've specifically studied the gastrointestinal tract of the fly, which is lined by a simple monolayered epithelium that is regenerated by stem cells that sit here on the basal side of the epithelium and regenerate these large cells, also called enterocytes. But they also generate a second cell type called enteroendocrine cells. So they're true stem cells. They're activated by damage, and they regenerate the tissue. Over time, these cells become deregulated and cause a dysplasia in the epithelium that we believe is driven by a number of changes that occur over time in the gastrointestinal tract, which include a gastric metaplasia, where you have changes in the gastric epithelium, which lead to actually changes in the pH of the gastric region, which then cause commensal dysbiosis, bacteria overproliferating, bacteria change the identity of the commensal microbiome changing, which then causes in the posterior midgut an inflammatory condition that triggers overproliferation of stem cells, misdifferentiation of stem cells. And the final really death-inducing phenotype is a loss of barrier function of the epithelium, where you can see here flies become blue if you feed them a blue food dye. In older populations, you have many more of these flies losing the barrier and becoming blue. And you can actually use this as a metric for impending death of these animals. We've, over the years, identified a number of molecular players that drive these phenotypes, and we've identified ways of perturbing these in a cell type specific and temporally controlled manner in the fly intestine to then improve homeostasis and ultimately extend lifespan. So the fly was quite rich in allowing us to dissect these temporal changes, dissect the stem cell specific changes that occur, and for example, showing us that we can perturb Jun kinase signaling in stem cells, but we need to perturb JAK-STAT signaling in enterocytes in order to push back these systems, right? So we can understand really on a complex level how we need to intervene in these tissues. Now, That is in the fly, and of course this is a basic biological question, but it actually predicts how we might need to intervene in similar tissues in vertebrates in order to improve health in aging tissues. Now, a few studies that we published over the years, one together with Brian here actually, showed, for example, that stem cells in the gut are losing the capacity to regenerate over time if they repeatedly are induced to regenerate, and they are repeatedly induced to regenerate through damage that then triggers activation of TOR that allows these cells to divide. But ultimately, activation of TOR also triggers differentiation of these cells. And so you can imagine that every time you call on them to divide and to regenerate the tissue, you also run the risk of losing their ability to maintain stemness. And you can actually measure this, and you can see this not just in the fly gut, but you can measure this also in the fly tracheal epithelium, which is a very similar epithelium to the fly gut epithelium, but even in the muscle of the mouse. Sorry, I think I said fly trachea, I meant mouse trachea, of course. And actually we did this in collaboration with Tom Rando's lab as well, to look at how satellite cells are behaving in a very similar way. They're also stem cells of the muscle. They respond to damage, they activate it. They show the same effect where TOR signaling activation is important for the regenerative process, but ultimately leads to loss of stem cells. And of course, you can prevent all this with the molecule that Matt talked about, rapamycin, that inhibits TOR signaling and can therefore improve the number of stem cells in aging tissues. And I don't want to go into any detail here, you can look at the papers. Other intrinsic changes in stem cells that were discovered in the fly are, for example, changes in metabolism, where we actually showed in this study that old stem cells actually acquire a metabolic phenotype that is very similar to cancer cells. So basically this Warburg metabolic reprogramming, and you can look at the details in this study. We further were interested in analyzing how aging intestines really influence systemically the other tissues, for example, the brain. And it's known, for example, that in IBD you have impact of inflammation in the gut on brain function. And in this particular case, in the fly, we were looking at a particular brain function, which is the loss of olfaction over time. And it turns out that in flies as well as in humans, olfactory perception declines with age. And you can measure this in various ways. In this case, for example, in flies, you look at a T maze, you allow the fly to go onto one side or the other, depending on their preference for an odor. And you can see that the preference changes over time. Turns out that this loss of olfaction that you see with age is also reflected in infectious diseases, where you have temporal decline of olfaction as a protective mechanism, which we can show in the fly, is a protective mechanism to prevent the animal from eating more or being attracted to food that contains pathogens, for example. And of course, you all know that with COVID-19, we all lose olfactory perception as well. So these are mechanisms that seem to occur in response to inflammation, not just in the gut, but in other tissues as well. And we showed that this age-related decline in olfaction in the fly is actually a consequence of the systemic inflammation caused by these changes I described in the gut. And so we can, for example, show that if you reduce the expression of a receptor that is specific for gut-derived cytokines in the olfactory epithelium of the fly, you can actually rescue the loss of olfaction that you see between young and old flies. You can rescue this here by just eliminating these receptors. And you can do the same by eliminating the cytokines that are derived from the gut in the gut, and you can rescue again this loss of olfaction in these older animals. So the mechanism here is that in aging flies, you have gut inflammation causing a release of cytokines, impacting the olfactory epithelium of the brain, and actually specifically acting on glial cells that support olfactory neurons. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail because you can read this in this study. Now, in unpublished work, we've actually asked the question of if aging impacts stem cells through intrinsic mechanism, but also through systemic mechanism, can we actually understand how senescent cells might be influencing stem cell function? And for that, we went into the mouse system, and we actually used organoids to ask whether the differentiation of organoids, of intestinal organoids, which you can actually produce in response to cytokine and growth factor exposure in vitro, whether that would be impacted by the senescent-associated secretory phenotype. And I don't think I need to introduce this to this audience. You all know that senescent cells accumulate with age in tissues. They secrete a number of inflammatory cytokines and growth factors, really of varying nature and composition. And we really don't fully understand how this cocktail of factors called the SASP might influence other tissues. So in the study we did, we actually took intestinal organoids from the mouse, grew them in their classic conditioned media, and you get these structures in which you have ultimately little crypts that recapitulate the small intestinal structure of a mouse intestinal epithelium. And in this experiment, we exposed these organoids to a control media or to conditioned media from senescent cells. And what you find is that when they're exposed to senescent conditioned media, they acquire these cystic phenotypes. So they do not differentiate these crypts. The stem cells actually seem to be dividing continuously. They grow a little bit larger than the control organoids, and they really fail in the ability to differentiate. We used a mass spec approach to understand the components in the senescent conditioned media that might be driving this phenotype. And it turns out that this is actually caused by the release of the N-terminal domain of a protein called PTK7 from senescent cells through MMP cleavage. Senescent cells upregulate matrix metalloproteinases, and they end up releasing the N-terminal domain of PTK7. When you actually take this secreted form of PTK7 and you treat stem cells with it, in this case, actually, you're looking at fly stem cells. If you treat fly stem cells with it, what you see is that secreted PTK7 will actually induce a migratory behavior in these cells. And we published this last year showing that in the fly, the same mechanism is actually driving movement of stem cells and is affecting the migration of stem cells to the site of injury and driving regeneration of the epithelium. And this is mediated by PTK7-induced non-canonical Wnt signaling in the stem cell. And so this was published in 2021. We showed in that case, in a physiological mechanism, in enteroendocrine cells, you release this PTK7 N-terminal domain and activate stem cells, which then will migrate towards the site of injury. Now, senescent cells are non-physiological in that context and actually continuously drive the response of stem cells to PTK7 and ultimately the activation of non-canonical Wnt signaling. And this is just a series of experiments to show that we can actually block MMP function in the senescent cells that will prevent the formation of these cystic phenotypes, and you can rescue this phenotype here, or you can use fibroblasts, make them senescent that are PTK7 knockouts. You lose this phenotype, or you can use antibodies that neutralize the secreted form of PTK7 in the conditioned media, and you end up rescuing this phenotype as well. So we have good evidence that PTK7 from senescent cells is really driving this cystic phenotype. And as I mentioned, the mechanism by which this occurs is through activation of non-canonical Wnt signaling, through actually Frizzled-7, driving calcium release and activation of the YAP transcription factor, which will ultimately prevent the loss of the break of symmetry in the organoids and allow the differentiation of crypts. What we don't know yet, and that's something we're working on right now, is whether PTK7 or the secreted form of PTK7 can serve as a target in vivo to improve regenerative capacity in the intestine. So this is where we've been looking into the age-related effects on endogenous stem cells and trying to understand whether mechanisms that drive this function of stem cells can be potential targets for therapy. What we're also trying to do is to ask whether in vivo reprogramming approaches can potentially increase the regenerative capacity, repair tissues, and allow targeting age-related diseases. This is a more complex question because what we're trying to do here and what many other groups in the field are trying to do right now is to basically turn back the clock of epigenetic differentiation. You all may have seen this diagram by Waddington, which basically depicts the rolling down the hill of a cell from its pluripotent state towards a differentiated state. And the idea being that you run down valleys of epigenetic programs, and these cells were thought not to be able to return to the pluripotent state. Of course, Yamanaka has shown that this is not entirely true, but that you can express certain transcription factors and drive these cells back into pluripotency, and then redifferentiate them into any other cell type. Now, in recent years, starting by work by Ispisua Belmonte's lab, it's been shown that expressing these Yamanaka factors, 4 transcription factors, in various contexts can actually serve as a way to repair tissues after damage and to improve regenerative capacity of tissues. And so there was a study in 2016 by Ispisua Belmonte's lab showing that you can rejuvenate animals that have a progeroid mutation, and you can basically extend the lifespan of these progeria animals. It's been shown in the lung that you can actually isolate bronchial epithelial cells, reprogram them partially ex vivo, and then put them back into the lung and improve fibrosis in the lung. It's been shown in cutaneous ulcers that you can reprogram cells to improve tissue repair. And it's been shown by David Sinclair's lab in glaucoma models that you can actually express 3 of the Yamanaka factors in the retina and rejuvenate retinal ganglion cells and improve their response to models for glaucoma, in this particular case, the nerve crush model. So all of these observations suggest that expression of these factors in vivo can potentially improve repair, but you have to know how to do this. And so what Ispisua Belmonte's lab did, for example, at the time, was to develop a protocol in which they would express the 4 Yamanaka factors in the mouse, but in a temporally controlled fashion. So they would express them for 2 days, and then go back, let them return for 5 days. And you could actually see that in these initial response, for markers for DNA damage, for example, were reduced over time. But actually, if you then allow the cells to recover without expression of the Yamanaka factors, these factors will return again, and these markers will return again. So you really have a temporal reprieve of DNA damage markers or aging markers in these models. Now, we actually started a collaboration with Juan Carlos Ispisua Belmonte to ask whether the long-term expression of these factors would be a safe intervention that potentially can be used to target aging or age-related diseases in humans as well. And so we asked whether this protocol, where you express the Yamanaka factors for 2 days in a dox-dependent manner, then you let them recover for 5 days, and then you repeat this effect, whether you can do this for months in mice and still have a beneficial effect, and more importantly, whether you would also see the advent of teratomas, which is a serious possibility here, or of other types of tumorigenic events. And it turns out that if you do this, for example, you start at 15 months and you analyze these animals at 22 months, over this period, we didn't see much of a difference here in body weight, nor in mortality of these animals. We never took them out all the way to see if we can extend lifespan, by the way. This is still something that needs to be done. But even in these animals that seem to be healthy, we also could see, based on molecular markers, we could see, for example, in gene expression profiles, that the expression of senescence markers was actually reduced. The expression of inflammation markers was reduced as well. If you look at the methylation clocks that we've heard about, you can actually show that, for example, in the kidney and the skin, you have a rejuvenation of these methylation clocks. And if you actually look at serum metabolites, and this is a bit complicated here, these are the young animals, these are the old animals without intervention, and these are the older animals with intervention. You can show that you have a rejuvenation of the serum metabolome as well. So that suggested that these long-term interventions, if you control them properly, can actually be safe and potentially effective. And if you look, for example, at tissues like the skin, you can show also that after these interventions, if you then injure the animal, you can actually rejuvenate the regenerative capacity of these tissues. The stem cells in the skin divide more extensively than in the old controls. And importantly, there is actually a reduced fibrosis after the injury is repaired. The tissue repairs with less fibrosis than before. Now, of course, we need to do this in other organs as well, and we're certainly interested in testing this in the lung, for example, as a model for lung fibrosis, and potentially develop interventions like that as interventions for lung fibrosis, kidney fibrosis as well. So with this, I want to end. I want to thank the lab and collaborators, of course, over the years and in recent years. These are some of the first authors that you've seen the stories highlighted. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your talk on family decision. Do you study the microbiome in the Drosophila gut?
Yes, yeah, we did. So what you see is that you have a pretty stereotypical transition from a pretty simple microbiome to a microbiome in which you have the hallmarks of dysbiosis, right? So basically, bacteria proliferate. You have the bacterial load increases quite significantly in old flies. But importantly, you also see changes in the location in which you find certain taxa, right? You see, for example, bacteria that are usually colonizing only the anterior midgut in old animals start to colonize the posterior midgut. And that's because you have this loss in acidity in the gastric region. And so these bacteria can start colonizing the posterior midgut, causing these inflammatory phenotypes that I mentioned earlier. So it's really both the load of bacteria changes, but also the composition in different regions of the gut start to change.
Other questions? You know, I'm reminded of an experiment that Matt did with the olfaction where he was trying to optimize lifespan extension by dietary restriction in worms, and that's very context dependent. But in this case, the longest lifespan extension was let the worms get to adulthood and then take the food away entirely. But the interesting result was if you put the food back on the top of the plate where the worms couldn't get to it, but they could sense it, it would shorten their lifespan again. So I'm wondering, so you can eat whatever you want as long as you have a clothespin on your nose, I guess.
That phenotype is seen in flies as well, actually. So there's a work by Scott Pleasher's lab showing the same thing in flies, that basically olfactory perception can impact your physiology in a way that negates the effects of dietary restriction, for example, right? This is not something we tested here, but in this case, what we showed in that paper was that when you feed flies a food source with enteropathogens and you induce this damage in the gut, the flies will lose for about a day, they will lose their olfactory perception and then recover it when they're young. The older animals lose olfactory perception completely due to the chronic effect of this inflammation in the gut, right? And so it's really this interplay between these two organs that ultimately leads to a decline in olfactory perception over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Is it true for other sensory systems as well, as an adaptive response, I mean?
So gustatory neurons in flies respond the same way in this short term. We did not look at them in aging, so it's not clear whether flies also lose gustatory perception with age. But the short-term loss in gustatory perception is also seen in the gustatory system. Yeah.
Matt.
Great talk. So that cyclic reprogramming experiment where you go from 15 to 22 months is clearly very exciting and intriguing. Are you or anybody else doing the experiment where you take it out longer and actually show that you can get effects on health span and hopefully lifespan as well? I think that's kind of the critically missing piece of data that we don't have at this point.
I mean, it has to be a well-powered experiment, and people are always a little bit hesitant to do these large cohort experiments for such a long time. But I know that Ispiso Belmonte's lab was doing this before they went to autos. And so I don't know if they're still doing this. I think there was some issues there with their cohorts. But it's an experiment that we're certainly interested in doing, and we haven't done it yet.
I have a question in the middle.
Thank you. In the Sinclair lab, they only used 3 Yamanaka factors, while you used 4.
Right.
I was wondering whether you could explain why you thought you needed 4, or, I mean, could you explain why 3 worked there and you needed all 4 to work?
I don't think we have an answer for that yet. We did not compare 3 factors with 4 factors in this study, right? So it's entirely possible that 3 factors will do the trick. Clearly, MYC, which is the 4th factor, is the most, if you want to say, dangerous factor when it comes to tumorigenesis. So I think David Sinclair's lab decided to just stick to the 3 and see if they see an effect in their models. That is not something that has been done in these long-term studies, and it's certainly something we are exploring now actually in specific disease models. So we're exploring this in, as I mentioned, the lung fibrosis models as well as in kidney fibrosis. And we are very interested in that question on whether we can reduce the number. More critically, I think, and that's something we're also doing now at Genentech, is to try and understand what are the actual epigenetic changes that occur in these 2 days, right? Because and of course with single-cell multiomics nowadays, we can really address that question and understand what are the transcription factor nodes that change the epigenome of these cells over this period of time. And I think this is an important question because it will allow us to narrow down the scope of the intervention, right? So we will eventually be able to maybe only target a specific factor downstream of the 4 factors, right? All questions that haven't been addressed, haven't been resolved yet, but they're critical now, and that's something we want to do, absolutely.
Thanks. We probably should move on. You can't leave yet.
I'm also getting time.
So we have to give you this. I forgot to remind all speakers that if you wear this tie, you have to list NUS as an affiliation on all future publications. So. I'd also like to remind people to silence their phones. We have 2 more talks before lunch. The next speaker is actually someone from Yale NUS and also NUS, and someone that I've been very fortunate enough to get to know and collaborate with since coming here. He's got his PhD in molecular biophysics from Oxford. I have to warn you, we have 2 physicists speaking right before lunch, but I've told them, please do it in a way that everybody can understand, and they're both great speakers, so we'll be okay. And so Jan Gruber will be speaking, and I think you're going to talk about aging, right? So
yeah, thank you very much to Andrea and Brian for letting me speak at this joyous occasion. I sort of stopped being a physicist and started being a biochemist 25 years ago in graduate school because I wanted to work on aging, and seeing the sort of paradigm shifts that are going on right now is really exciting. So for the longest time, that wasn't the case. I'm going to talk about clocks, and I think clocks are, very interesting. I'm very excited about them. Oh, I can see it down there. Okay. Just as a sort of little segue into it. Measuring time has been vastly important to science and technology and really opened up the world. So the development of the, ship's clocks that you could take with you on your journeys allows you to measure longitudes and therefore opens up the world to navigation. There are more examples of this, but all of these clocks have in common that they're really some sort of oscillator, some sort of pendulum or oscillating process, and a counter, so you're counting number of oscillations. So if you measure time this way, what you mean is you're measuring some standard units of the oscillator swinging, which is quite different from what we mean by biological clocks. And there we go. So the question is, what's the difference between wall clock time or calendar time or chronological time? So if you use the Earth as your oscillator, then you measure days and you do chronological time or calendar time, and what we mean by biological clocks. And so how do you measure biological age, and also why bother? Why is that important? So this is what I'm going to try to cover, and I'm going to do a little bit of an overview, and then I'm going to talk about one particular example that we are working on. So, how to define biological age. And for that, we actually go back to Gompertz, who was a mathematician and actuary who discovered Gompertz mortality law, which basically states that the risk of dying increases exponentially with time. So here is a curve with the chance of dying per year on the y-axis and age on the x-axis. And I think that blip here is puberty, if I'm not wrong. So this is probably induced by exuberance, but the rest is basically an exponential increase in the risk of dying. This is in a log plot, so this is 1 in 10,000, and this is 10% a year. So this is an exponential increase on a log scale. In humans, there's a characteristic time, which is called the mortality rate doubling time, which in humans is 8 years. So every 8 years, the risk of dying doubles. And so over 80 years, you get 10 doublings, and 2 to the 10, sorry for being playing with this, 2 to the 10 is 1,024, so that means your risk of dying between the age of 1 and the year of 80 increases by 1,000-fold, your risk per year to die. And so that's quite a substantial increase, and this is why you get more diseases and you're much more likely to die in older ages. And this is the law. And the trick about this is that this constant here is the time, and that this mu is the risk of dying. So this really is what we mean by biological age. It's the time that defines your risk of dying. So if you have a person that has a 1% risk of dying per year, then on this curve you would say they're about 60 years old. So this is what we mean by biological time. Other animals have different mortality rate doubling times, so mice do this doubling every 3 months, and the worms that I normally work with do it every 3 days, doubling their risk of dying. But the fundamental law is the same, so there's something conserved about how biology does dying and the risk of dying, because this risk function is the same as just scales. It's different for technological devices. Computers, for instance, don't follow this law. Their risk of failing is not on an exponential graph. And of course, what's important to realize is that this death is not some magical death from old age, quietly falling asleep and not waking up. What this means is that age-dependent diseases all increase dramatically as age progresses. That's what is actually killing you. So it's the risk of dying from these diseases that this models. Okay, so why make all this fuss about talking about this and giving a little lecture on this? And I think it's because it's a nice way of restating the geroscience paradigm, which basically says the aging processes, call them pillars, call them hallmarks of aging, but they integrate into a system state. In the animal has a one parameter system, which is called a state, which is called a biological age. And this biological age defines the risk of dying from all these age-dependent diseases. So the important thing in geroscience is that we think that there is a biological age, and the task is to modify that rate, the rate with which the biological age changes, either move it backwards or slow down the rate with which it increases. Okay, so then you're going to say, well, wait a minute, Gompertz went and did all of this with the calendar birthdays of people, so really isn't tau, or isn't that biological age just not identical to calendar age? And the answer is no, because of course we know many ways, and we have seen some already, to modulate the risk of dying mortality in various, in animals, sorry, in worms and flies and mice, and increasingly also in humans. So, lifestyle and diet and genetics, mutations can massively extend the lifespan. Selection experiments have been used in flies to massively extend lifespan. So we can modify the risk of dying, the mortality function with time. And so therefore, we know that we can modify the rate of aging, the aging rate, the rate with which the biological time progresses. I'm going to give you one of my favorite examples because it's from my lab, so it's completely biased. So this is a C. elegans worm, and they normally live about 30 days. So this is survival percentage, and this is day, and by day 30 they're all dead. And if at maturity you give them a triple combination of drugs, you can almost double their median lifespan. So these guys, oops, sorry, can I go back? Yeah, I think I can. These guys here live far longer, but they're also just younger. So, at 20 days, half of the control worms are dead, the other half is dying, but almost all the treated animals are healthy and alive, and so they are just younger. So therefore, we know we can change biological time, and many people have said that, and we have evidence in other animals too, but this happens to be what I do. So, great, so we can change it. Why would we want to measure it, and how to do it? And of course, it's very easy if you see a cohort study like the one I just showed you. Just wait until everybody's dead, and then you know what their biological risk of dying was, and then you can calculate their biological age. But that's inconvenient in people. And so what's needed and what's exciting is omics-based aging clocks. So things where you can take a data set, a sample, blood sample, or a saliva sample, and you can infer biological age. And of course, the existence proof of these are the epigenetic clocks that have already been mentioned, which is where all the excitement originated, where you're measuring DNA methylation marks, and then you build a large model that, this is rather degraded, but that doesn't just tell you the chronological age nowadays of a patient or person or volunteer, but actually the risk of dying. So this is, you can almost not see this, but the green line are people who start out at age 50 having a predicted age of 60, so they're 10 years older in the age classifier, and then they die younger. And whereas the people who are 10 years younger, who are 40 at calendar age 50, live longer. So the idea is, that's of course the idea, that you can use the predictor and it will tell you what the mortality of that person is. So I was working, when this happened, I was working with Marcus and the lipid incubator at NUS. On lipidomics for some various studies we were doing. And so the question is, can we do something like this with lipids? So that was the motivation that triggered all of this. Now, why would this work? Why would you be able to take some random molecules, measure them, then build some sort of statistical model and infer biological age? And I'm going to do something quite hand-waving here because I know Peter is speaking next, and he's going to talk about PCAs and dynamical systems much more than I will, and I promise Brian not to be a physicist about it. But fundamentally, living things are complex regulatory networks with lots of nonlinear interactions. And they communicate across all sorts of scales of organization. So for instance, you might have some transcriptional changes, and these transcriptional changes then lead to changes in some molecules like lipids or proteins, and they then change what the cell or organism is doing, and so you get changes in metabolomics, in metabolism. So what this means is that you can look at any one of those type of data sets, and you will get an idea about a change in system state. Right. Now, most of the things that an organism does is very short term. It's physiology. It's responding to environmental perturbation or small scale problems or some endogenous cycles. But those things are on the order of seconds, hours, days. There are very few things that occur over the course of significant fractions of the lifespan. And those things are either development and growth when you're young, aging when you're mature, and eventually degenerative diseases. So what you're looking for is, this is just a placeholder for complex dynamical systems, just a tractor. But what you're looking at is the movement through some sort of phase space, and you're looking at very slow correlated change that where certain features change over the course of a significant fraction of lifespan. And this would be what that looks like. So you have feature 1 and feature 2, could be 2 proteins, 2 lipids, methylation sites, and they have a correlated change across your data set. And a neat way of extracting things that show correlated change over a long time frame is to do a principal component analysis of either longitudinal trial or of many different animals of different ages. And then what you do is you place a coordinate system in there that aligns with the noise, with a large covariance, and then you rotate it, and you get a reduced coordinate system that describes movement through that space along those axes. And again, Peter will probably explain this better than I can, but the trick is the principal components are a way of extracting those sort of long correlated but slow dynamics. And that's basically what the clock that we built is based on, and also the methylation clocks now use this, and Peter has done a transcriptional clock on this, and so have we. But the trick about this is that this has a few advantages. One is that you're reducing the dimensions, that means the complexity of the model, and in a omics data set you might have thousands of features and you're trying to infer aging from it by basically reducing the major components, and you've all seen these PCA plots with one or two components, but really you have as many as the rank of the data matrix. So you get a reduction in dimensionality, and that can be informative. For instance, if your one axis, to take a clinical example, is cholesterol and the other one is blood pressure, then suddenly you end up with a principal component that's cardiovascular risk related, right? Because these are people that have both high cholesterol and high blood pressure and vice versa. So that's a way to actually interpret how the weights of the clock give meaning to the weights of the clock. And the other one, and this is a transcriptional clock that we have, or a transcription data set in flies, is that you can get aging directions quite obviously. So this is young, middle-aged, and old flies, and then they're male and female. So these are the females, these are the males. And as you can see, the first principal component, the first axis that the model identifies is sex. So yes, the female flies are all very different from the male flies. But the second direction is very immediately aging related. So they move up as they get older. Maybe the men become a little bit more female as they grow up, but fundamentally you get a direction that's related to aging, which you then can use to build, by regression models that infer age. So that's the advantages. So the basic idea is trajectories along some of the first components, of the PCA largest singular values closely related to aging. So that you use as the input to your aging model. So it's regress the PC of your data matrix, basically. So let's try this with lipids. So model organism was C. elegans. There we go. And then we took different samples from a cohort at different ages, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 days of age. We did 4 repeats each. Advantage in doing this in model organisms as a proof of principle is you can do it in 30 days. And the other advantage is that they're extremely homogeneous. If you did this in a clinical cohort, like having 4 samples per age is not going to work because you're not averaging across individuals. Then do the lipidomics, get a table like this. You have the lipid species here, all the different types of lipids we measured, and then you have the samples this way. So that's the data matrix that you're doing all these transformations on. And this shows you the correlation of, this moved, okay, the correlation of some of the PCs versus age. This is bizarre. So this actually shows you PC 2, 3, and 4. It was 1, 2, and 3 before, so the field moved. But what you can see is the PCs 2 and 3 show clear age-dependent increase. So this is the ages 5, 10, 15, and this is the value of along that axis in feature space. And so they both go up. And this one, well, shows a complicated pattern. And then you basically build a regression model against this. And what you get is, unsurprisingly, that you successfully get back the ages of your wild-type animals. So these are the ages that they actually had. These are the ages that are inferred. And that has to be the case because that's the training data set. That's not surprising. But then you can test your model by using some either slow aging or fast dying, fast aging mutant strains. So in this case, we took H1, which is an IGF mutant, ages slowly, EAT1, caloric restricted, or mutant that eats less and lives longer. And MEV1 makes a lot more free radicals and dies young. And we didn't retrain the model. We used the model we had in those mutant strains. So the model has never seen these strains other than when we asked them, how old are these animals? And so you transform your feature vectors into the PCA coordinates, and then you basically use the linear model to predict the age. And what we get is this. So the H1 animals and the EAT animals, which are slow aging, have a slower increase in biological age, that means inferred age versus the chronological age, whereas the MEV1, the ones that are making more ROS and dying young, have a quicker increase. So this is your reference. Wild type has ages 1 day per day of calendar. The MEV1 ages 2 days per day of calendar, And both of these control strains age about half a day per day of calendar. So that's, confirms that the model can, even though this is done in mutants and they have various differences in lipid composition by being mutants, can actually tell the difference in aging rates by looking just at the lipid samples. And then basically we can go back to our Gompertz model and scale this to calculate what lifespan curves should look like for those animals. And so what we get is the wild type is about 3.5 days in our lab, the MEV is 2 days of doubling, so every 2 days their risk of dying doubles, and the EAT is 7 days. And if you then simulate the lifespan curves, you get a reasonable agreement with the experiments in our lab. So this is what the lifespan survival for the MEV look like. They die young, normal, and lifespan extended. And that's just by showing a bunch of lipid samples at different ages. So you can tell the differences even though you're comparing wild type with mutants. And because PCAs are rotations, have weights, you can then do a sort of enrichment analysis where you're figuring out what's actually driving these differences. And interestingly, the first PC is just decreased, so all the lipids involved in the first PC get lost with age, so these are all the things that are running out. But PC2 has come very specific enriched species, so there's some ceramides that increase more quickly or increase with age, and then there's specific LPCs that decrease with age. And you can then go in the literature and try to figure out whether you have a mechanism that you can get for changes in those lipid species. So the conclusions to make is, one, and you can do this with any molecule is the point. You could do, we have done it with transcriptomics, you can do it with proteomics. It's just an interesting approach, and the interesting thing is that these are locks that tell you something about their keys. So if you want to change aging using these clocks, then when you use it with something like an inflammatory panel, then you get an idea which processes are involved in the age classifier because you can read out what drives the differences. There are many other approaches. This was just the lipid one that we did. People have done this with a wide variety of data. There are many more open questions. For instance, whether reducing the clock, actually reduces the mortality, or that's just true if you look at the data from a cohort that's already died. I think lipids are exciting because the effects in an organ somewhere in the body can be seen in the blood lipids, and so I think it's an exciting type of molecule to explore in this context. I thought dimensionality reduction and PCA prior to the regression worked well to build these models, and otherwise I just want to thank the people who've actually contributed to this project and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom first and then Andrea. Oh, sorry. We'll get there.
Thank you. It was very interesting. So there is some data in mammals that if you look at transcriptomics, for example, that you don't see a rate of aging, but that you see kind of bursts of accelerated aging. Your models, I guess, have 1 tau, right? So 1. Can you pick up changes in rate over time as opposed to a single rate?
I mean, you need enough, basically, time points as one thing to see a change, right? So we've done the minimal experiment to try out whether this idea could work, whether you could make a clock from lipids. And so if the curve actually looked like this, but you sort of only measure it at 4 points, you're going to fit a linear model because that's the easy thing. But absolutely, you would expect that to be the case. And if you get a high enough resolution, you should be able to see that. The other thing, to be completely honest about this actually worked quite well for the low number of data we have. We couldn't have done machine learning, like neural networks or something with the tiny data sets we have. And one of the reasons is that each of these data point averages like 1,000 animals, right? So all this inter-individual variability is like averaged out. If you did this with a clinical data set, you would, the worms eat the same food, they have the same genetics. This is literally a proof of principle. To do it in a clinical setting, you need much more data, or even in a mouse cohort, because you would need to sort of remove the individual variability.
Yeah, great talk. I have a little bit trouble on just choosing one clock, because we know that different clocks being special for certain organs are different, and the overlap might be just minimal. Also, the rate of aging within one individual is very different in different organ systems. So can you comment on that? And I know it might be hard in worms, but
so that's why we're
translational to humans.
Yeah. So Max, who's the one of Brian's PhD students, who sort of I sidelined a little bit to get excited about this, has a data set in mouse brain, and they're looking at different areas of the mouse brain, and he builds a clock for every one of those areas, and then asks the question whether there's a sort of pan, meaning the same thing as the methylation clocks. Is there a pan brain clock for the mouse? Or is there something completely different? And we haven't done perturbations with that yet because the data set is just a set of longitudinal data, but or different age data. But absolutely, I expect that to be the case. The only thing I'd say is like the sort of idea behind this is maybe to say that if you take bloods, you're sort of getting signal from different places in the body, and so even though because you can't really take tissue samples from brain, it's frowned upon. Therefore, this might be a nice way of integrating body-wide signals.
Yeah, I don't know if you've even seen this data, but Max has looked at different brain regions, as you said, and they correlate quite well, but it looks like the regions of the brain that have ongoing adult neurogenesis are biologically younger than the regions that don't. So that'll be, if that holds to be true, it'll be really interesting. You had a question, and then here.
Should I just shout?
Yeah.
I just had one question on how you picked the cocktail to give to the worms.
Oh.
Something that started with lipids, or were you going for a broader aging cocktail?
No, this was a previous study. I just used it as a little example of lifespan extension. This was an attempt at designing a synergistic drug combination by taking different things that were well established in the literature, and it just worked very well.
Okay, so Nir and then Feng Li.
Terrific proof of principle. Congratulations, that was really nice. So the concern, again, when you go to mammalians or to go humans, if you take a sample 8 hours fasting or 10-hour fasting, it's going to be very different. And also there's the food issue that will affect lipid, of the last meal, basically. So you have to find something that is independent of those things. How are you thinking of that?
I think one way is that you will see, for instance, PCs that are not age-related and they're, for instance, diet-related, right? So what I showed with the sex, right? If you have the transcriptomics clock, there's a huge difference. If you mix male and female flies, you're making a huge mistake, and that's actually where this data came from. We realized they had to keep them separate because there's a huge PC that's just sex-based. And the same thing, you did this and you recorded when people have eaten or fasted, you will probably find PCs that are strongly fasting-dependent, right? And they will be useless unless you control for that. But if you have a large enough sample, then of course there's something remaining there will not be along those axes, but will be systematically age dependent. Now there's worries like if people who reach a certain age stop eating or change their diet habit, what you're seeing is a change in diet, which looks like an aging pathway. You can't distinguish that. We've actually played around, just because of that question with some of the published clinical data from these, big studies, cross-sectional studies, and Hannah's. And yeah, so if you throw these tools at a human cohort with giant variability that you have no idea about, all the predictions become much less tight, right? That's absolutely the case. But then, yeah, and I'm not saying this is the best way of doing it. It's just the way we tried first. There are probably better tools.
2 more quick questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question about there are a bit. First of all, congratulations for the nice work, elegant work. But just for your comments, all the omics markers, right? You used to derive the PCs, the principal component, somewhat correlated with age, right? So they are basically aging markers. Yeah, maybe some have a higher correlation, some have no smaller correlation. When you derive the PC with those markers, so you have PC1, PC2, PC3, then you show the correlation between PC and the actual age or your wall clock, right? It's a bit circular in the way of reasoning. You use something correlate with age, and then use that to show the validity of the clock.
So So what I would say is the PCA doesn't know the age, right? The principal component analysis itself just maximizes covariance or correlation of features. So it identifies themes in the data. But then we built a model, a regression model of the PCs against age. So yes, of course, as I said, the fact that that predicts the age of the training set is just, otherwise you messed up your linear model. It has to, right? But the fact that the same PCs, as in the same coordinate transformation and projection on those axes, like directions in feature space, predict the age of mutant animals that have, for instance, their PCs which are strongly driven by the mutation itself, like 100-fold, right? Still predict the age of the animals in accordance with what your lifespan says, I think is not circular.
I see. Yeah, so how about introduce an independent variable? For example, you look at the physiology or function of the C. elegans.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, then you can say, okay, this clock really correlates to functional or physiological.
And again, if you did this with clinical data, we had lots and lots of observations on the people, then you would definitely do this. It's just we know very little about the worms, right? Like what they did. I mean, we'd have to specifically make an assay and measure it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Last question.
All right, great talk, Jan. So comment and a question. My comment is, I think as a field, we need to just be much more careful in being precise when we talk about aging clocks and what we actually mean. And I think, you can build a clock for lipids or epigenetics or transcriptomics or kidney, brain, heart, all measuring parts of biological aging. Are any of them actually measuring biological aging as a whole? And I think as a field, we haven't been great at that. But my question is sort of related to that in this concept of health span versus lifespan. And, as you know, there are people who claim that they've identified interventions that extend health span without extending lifespan. You sort of defined your biological aging clock based on mortality. And how do you think about that if an intervention extends health span and it doesn't do anything to mortality?
Yeah, I mean, so as the clock is concerned, of course, it depends what you use as your Y variable, right? We do have the luxury in the worms that we know exactly what the survival at each of those times is. So for us, calendar age is mortality. In people, that's not true. Again, if you use this NHS data set, people are 45, but they're not all 45. Their health status is very different. If you build the model against health span, then it would be predicting health span, right? It's just you have to have that variable.
Right, but what does that mean for biological aging? Is biological aging health span or lifespan or? I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm asking you because I'm sort of confused.
I'm seeing your point. So basically, Gompertz is only interested in death, and that's the function you fit. And so then you're saying that's the one variable so that is true. Yeah. So we have also had drugs, thinking about this, we also had drugs that have massively compressed morbidity, which I for a long time thought wasn't going to happen. I thought it was essentially always tracking, right? You live longer, and so it takes longer for you to get sick, and therefore, you're always going to have the same amount of decline at the end. But we have had, in the worms, thinking about it, drugs that, just compress the morbidity. And yeah, then you would need to have a new concept.
Thanks, Jan.
Cheers.
I think, I have something for you.
Thank you. Thanks. Wow.
Well, I think those last questions were really relevant for our next speaker, too. I think the question of multiple types of age or one type of age and how it differs and how you measure it or something he's thought a lot about. I've known Peter also for quite some time. He's the co-founder and CEO of Gero, which is a company that looks at both diagnosing the rate of aging and also developing interventions. And we've been fortunate enough to collaborate with this company doing some validation studies of targets in mice. He got his PhD at the University of Amsterdam in theoretical physics. And a PhD also from Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, and then decided to be a biologist. I don't know how that's working out for you, but maybe he can tell us. Thanks a lot for coming, Peter.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. So let's see if anything works. Okay, so as Brian said, Gero is doing both diagnostics. We're trying to develop an anti-aging therapeutics. And we're doing that by looking at very large data sets of human data. basically thinking that in very large data sets of living and aging humans, almost everything happens. And the idea is that with lots of data, you can see what aging is in humans relative to animals and what you can do about that. So there were wonderful talks today already about hallmarks of aging. So there are lots of them. So everyone understands, also experimentally we see that most of them are correlated. So that's why I think it's very important to understand which of them are correlated or not, how many of those are truly independent, and most importantly, which of those are actionable. Because that leads us to a very practical question. What are the pragmatically limits of possible life extension in humans? How do we make sure that what we're doing actually leads to the most potent interventions in humans? So thank you to Jan for the introduction to the principal components. Actually, I wanted to try to give a talk without actually using them, but whenever we look at the biological system, so let's talk about aging from the data science perspective. So whenever we look at the biological system, it's always too complicated. We always measure a small window, like lipids, epigenetics, functional measures, maybe a few thousands variables out of how many? Infinitely many variables that are describing a living system. So fortunately, almost all of them are correlated. So if you look, for example, at blood cell counts in mice, this is the data from mouse phenome database. You can see this is the matrix of correlations. The higher, the more yellowish is the color, the more is the correlation between the features. You can see that even there are more, even that there are many features, most of them are correlated. And if you do some clustering analysis, you try to see which clusters of features move together, you would see that there is a large cluster of features, which is called principal component 1, doesn't matter, which is correlated to age, and all other clusters of features do not correlate to age. This is a universal feature in all data sets that you have from aging animals. One, two, very few principal components are correlated to age, and all others do not. Which means that if we look at aging, there are only very few relevant variables. That is very tempting to call aging clocks. I mean, there could be one, like in mice, there may be a few, but the most important is that it doesn't matter how many features we observe, how many features we have, and which are required to characterize the living system. They operate in large clusters, and normally the largest cluster has the most correlation to age. This is not actually limited to biology, so people know it in engineering sciences for a long time. So when people look at, for example, market crashes or energy grid collapses, whenever a complex system decides to disintegrate, normally it requires a cooperative effort from many, many components. It takes a while to establish cooperation. So that's why whenever you want to fail and you are strongly interacting, you need to develop a very slow mode that encompasses lots of subsystems. And that's how you have two major features. You have strong correlations, you have increasing correlations, so before you die, counterintuitively, you get more correlations between your features. Those correlations produce very strongly fluctuating features, and those clusters of features start moving slowly. So this is a very cool, almost universal biomarker of disintegration. So with this kind of ideology in mind, we take on longitudinal data. So we believe that in order to understand dynamics, you have to have trajectories. So we're looking for ways how to look at trajectories of aging humans or animals. So what we do is that we're taking those vectors of biological features. And remember, I told you that there are always very few relevant variables that are describing aging. Everything is correlated, which means that we're using machine learning systems in order to reduce the dimension of the signal. So to reduce multiple biological measurements into very few variables, like Z here. Let's think about one for simplicity. So we use what is called encoder-decoder pairs. These are machine learning tools in order to take large vectors and compress them into very few variables. And then what's most important, we follow the animals or humans along the trajectories, and we're trying to fit those correlated features into an equation of motion. So basically we do what is called autoregressive models. Those autoregressive models are used, for example, to predict the stock prices from the current prices. It's like we're doing a fortune-telling machine. We take a compressed representation of the organism state now in order to predict the, for example, future electronic medical record of the same animal. What's most important is that we fit the equation of motion. We try to see how the fluctuations of the organism state develop in time. And the most important variable here is this autoregressive coefficient, which is if is larger than 0, then the fluctuations of the organism state get amplified as we age, so we start disintegrating, that's aging. And if this coefficient is less than 0, then the system is resilient, which means that if I perturb such a system, that system would come back to recover from the fluctuations and come back to the norm. So basically, by measuring this coefficient, I can tell you if this system is stable, which means it can live for a very long time, or if it's unstable, amplifies errors and fluctuations and is going to die. So basically, when you apply such a thing, for example, to a mouse phenome database, which has tens of thousands of longitudinal trajectories of aging mice, you get one variable that is autocorrelated to each other, to itself, and that variable, yeah, by the way, by doing such systems, you do not fit to chronological age, a good question today here, so it's not a circular argument. You don't know what the age dependence would be. You get the age dependence which is in the data. So for example, in mice, the age dependence of that, of the measure of the largest correlated cluster of features actually evolves. This is the age, this is the machine learning conferred feature from the blood cell counts. So you can see that this measure is actually going exponentially with age. So different colors here are different experiments from Andrei Gudkov's lab from the US. The interesting thing here are the red dots. So the red dots are mice of all ages that are too sick to live. So they are killed by the ethical committee, interestingly enough. So you can see that machine learning can automate the decision of the ethical committee. So in the laboratory, human-level intelligence allows to find animals that are too sick to live, and you can see that in the laboratory, at least, animals are dying from extreme biological age. I mean, the biological age is going up. It's naturally to call this thing a biological age. It's going up exponentially. The doubling time is exactly the mortality rate doubling time. So in mice, it's very simple. Mice, it's like nuclear bombs. So they amplify errors. The errors produce more errors. It gets exponential. The doubling rate is exactly the mortality rate doubling time. So mice are simply dynamically unstable. They cannot live. So they live 2 years. So if you do the same thing in humans, you find very interesting and, well, as I will try to convince you, somewhat disturbing picture. So obviously, I mean, that's how data scientists learn biology, right? So you do such an autoregressive autocorrelation analysis. You build something that looks like whatever this dynamic frailty index, let's call it biological age for the lack of better measure. And then you plot it as a function of age in large data sets, including humans, and you can find, of course, that most of the time, at least the first 20 years of life, humans do not age, so that thing shows you the development. So you can see that contrary to mice, humans develop, reach something that looks like a stationary state, like metastable state, and then they start slowly disintegrating, and this is really slow. So if you fit an exponent here, the mortality rate doubling time would be something like 100 years. So there is no exponent here. So humans don't want to disintegrate, contrary to mice. So in humans, we actually acquired a large data set from a consumer diagnostic company in order to have these longitudinal measurements in humans. Actually, nothing that I'm presenting here today can be actually seen from cross-sectional data. So longitudinally, you can see how the fluctuations of the organism state develop in time. And you can actually measure what is called an autocorrelation function of the organism state. For example, I have IL-6 today. The IL-6 in 1 minute will be the same. The IL-6 in 3 weeks will be most probably totally uncorrelated to IL-6 in, let's say, in 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and so on. So you can see that if I look at the fluctuations of the biological age in humans, these are actually the step counts from wearable devices. These are biological age from blood cell counts. You can see the same thing. So in a few weeks, the organism state becomes decorrelated. So if I'm disturbed, I get back to the norm and I forget about the stress. So basically the decay time of the autocorrelation function gives you the resilience. This is the actual measurement of the resilience. It tells you how long does it take for me to get back to the norm. And you can see that humans are getting back to the norm when they're healthy and young in about 3 to 5 weeks from the perturbation. That's what the insurance companies know for a long time. Probably I should not be telling it in the medical establishment, but nevertheless it's known. If I do the biological age measurement in people who never smoked, people who are smoking have biological age measurements. These are from blood, these are from physical activity measurements. It's everywhere the same. I'm trying to talk about universal features here. So universally, people who smoke have higher biological age relative to the sex and age matched cohorts. People who never smoked have smaller biological age, and people who quit smoking have the same small biological age, which means that humans are stable, contrary to mice. Mice are exponentially disintegrate, but humans are stable, which means that if I smoke and I quit smoking, I go back. If I get alpha-ketoglutarate, I presume I get younger for a while, and I think if we stop getting it, the biological age would go up. So the question is then, what happens? I mean, if I'm stable, if I don't want to disintegrate, why do I age? Why do we have this exponential acceleration of mortality? And the interesting thing here, just a moment, just a moment. And the interesting thing here is that if you take large cohorts of humans and you measure the resilience, the recovery rate, you would find that the recovery rate is actually going down as we age. And it doesn't matter how you measure it. You can measure it in blood, you can measure it in physical activity measures, you can measure it in DNA methylation, as I will show you soon. So the interesting thing is that the resilience, as Philip actually told us today, the resilience is linearly going down with age, even in the most healthy people. I mean, this resilience is calculated in people who have no chronic diseases here. So as the resilience is going down, the range of the fluctuations increases, because if it takes longer for me to get back to the norm, the range of the fluctuations is going up, and you can see that the inverse variance of the biological age is going down, which means that the fluctuation range, the amplitude of the fluctuations increases and is reaching, whenever the inverse variance is 0, it means that the fluctuations would be infinite at about some age, 100 plus 100, 150 years. It doesn't matter what you measure. You can measure blood cell counts, you can measure pheno age, you can measure physical activity, doesn't matter. Since the resilience is going down, the fluctuations are diverging, which means that if the resilience is 0, the fluctuations are infinite and you are dead anyway, even if you don't have diseases, which is possibly an important possibility. Impossible situation. So how should I visualize such a situation? I mean, I've been telling you what the data is telling you. Now I want to tell you how I'm thinking about this data. So if I think about myself to be a ball, like fluctuating organism state along some axis, let's call this biological age axis, doesn't matter. So since humans are stable most of the time, let's try it again. My fluctuations are stable most of the time, but because of aging, the regulatory potential changes, the amplitude of the fluctuation increases, and then in some unfortunate moment in life, the barrier doesn't exist anymore. I'm crossing the barrier and disintegrating. So that's what people are doing according to the data which we were able to analyze. So basically there are two processes. So here you are a human, or maybe a naked mole rat, but once you cross the barrier, you become a mouse. So you start disintegrating, so you develop a late life phenotype, which is, accompanied with all those terrible diseases and deaths. So the loss of resilience is actually the prerequisite, the required condition before you develop frailty and die. Two different phenotypes. And as I'm trying to convince you, mice don't have this phenotype. Mice are never stable. Mice are born unstable and they are dying in 2 years. Humans are living 60 years without frailty because it takes a while to leave this state. Okay, that was the only funny picture, interesting picture in the presentation. So the basic question is now, what causes the loss of resilience, right? So if the resilience is the most important phenotype in humans in relation to aging, what is causing the loss of resilience? So for that, we are looking at all kinds of data that we can get. So for example, this is the DNA methylation. So this is the principal component now of the DNA methylation. So what do we see in DNA methylation? In DNA methylation, in mice, you remember you had one age-dependent feature. In humans, we have two, and this is very important. So in humans, we always have one feature that is almost ideally linearly developing with age. I mean, it's a linear function of age. The variance of the DNA of the first principal component in DNA methylation also linearly increases with age, which means that this is a stochastic process. This is a drift with stochastic component. By the way, this linear PCA component correlates to the Howard methylation age. And then there is another principal component that has a hyperbolic, actually it's a hyperbolic shape, a dependence on age, and its inverse variance is actually decreasing. So the fluctuations, the variance of this principal component will be infinite at about 100-something years. So what I'm trying to tell you that even though we are measuring different components of the same system, we see the same universal behavior. There is always one feature that is linear with age, which is probably stochastic drift. And then all other features are driven by the linear feature, and some of them become unstable at about 100 years old. And these are essentially, these features are reaction coordinates that are describing the disintegration and death in the organism. The same happens in the electronic medical records. If I do principal components on electronic medical records, I would see one component that is correlated to the total number of diseases, and it would also have a linearly increasing variance. So the last punch, how should I understand that? So probably I should think about human being as a large collection of functional states. It could be methylation states, mutations, it could be diseases, doesn't matter. I mean, there are infinite number of such states. And I can order them by the transition rates. So basically those states are metastable, which means that I'm born here, and then over the lifetime, once in a while, due to the fluctuations, I'm flipping in those states, reaching more stable states. So if such a transition is rare, I probably face one transition like this over my lifetime, and the inverse transition would not occur. So there are lots of transitions that are practically irreversible. So most of those transitions, and the number of such transitions is really huge. Most of them are so rare that I cannot predict. I mean, they can happen in one cell in one way, in the other cell in the other way. The only certain thing about those transitions is the total number of such transitions. These are rare, uncorrelated events, which means that over lifetime I develop lots of them, and the total number of such events is more or less linear in time. So that's what you see in the first principle component. This is not a single process. It's not like aging is a disease. It's entropy. So the important part here is that if I measure the configurational entropy in the DNA methylation or in electronic medical records, I see that the entropy is growing linearly with age. So the linear feature is always the entropy. So this is lots of rare uncorrelated events, which together produce linear stress on all other systems in your body in such a way that the soft modes, those modes that are allowed to flip often in response to stresses and so on, feel the linear stress produced by the entropic component, and that's why you have a remodeling of the regulatory potentials, you have the loss of resilience, you have the increased probability of crossing the barriers, developing diseases and death. So as a physicist in the past, I will tell you, whenever you see that something correlates to the entropy, it's a bad sign. That probably means that it's very hard to reverse. So, I mean, lots of arguments about that. So if this is true, what I'm saying, most probably it means that the entropic component of human aging is hard to be reversed. It can be stopped. So you can think about developing drugs that can stop it, not reverse. And all the other processes, of course, can be reversed. But as you have seen, the first principal component of human aging, that has the largest variance in the data, is probably not reversible. So with that in mind, with that picture, you can develop more sophisticated versions of fortune-telling machines that you can apply now to very large data sets of electronic medical records. There, we have now millions of humans. I mean, lots of people are digitalized these days. You can buy 100 million electronic medical records from a provider. These are ideal longitudinal signals, right, because they are spanning tens of years. With them, you can run the models of the type which I described, and what you can get is the biological age as a function of age. So different lines here are the people with different diagnoses, so you can see that the biological age as an entropic process is unrelated to diseases. It drives the diseases, but it's unrelated to the major diseases. And on top of that, you have a bunch of functional units corresponding to different diseases that are failing with a probability which is controlled by the biological age. So this, let's say, the thermodynamic or entropic biological age is the driver of remodeling of the regulatory potentials. It changes the resilience, and the loss of resilience produces all those diseases, and that's how we end up in the hospital and die. So the conclusions here are the following. So different animals have different properties, not only the levels of certain proteins, transcript factors. That's not important. What's important is if you're stable or not. If your regulatory network is unstable, you amplify errors and die quickly. Humans are fortunate to be stable most of their lives, which means that late life humans and mice have similar features. They disintegrate in a similar way. Humans are stable, And the relevant phenotype in humans is resilience, not frailty. Loss of resilience causes frailty. And the difference between humans and mice, in my opinion, produce what I would call a preclinical trap. I mean that whichever hypothesis regarding aging you may have, you go to mice first. Since mice are not stable, do not have resilience, you select for drugs that have the best effect in mice. And those drugs, unfortunately, would have the best effect late life in humans when you have lots of frailty and no resilience. So in order to have strong interventions against aging in the future, those interventions which help you to not regain, but at least maybe to maintain your resilience, you have to do animal studies in a much smarter way. And this is still, I think, for the future considerations. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
A really terrific talk and concepts. So I have a comment and a question. The comment is that entropy is not behaving the same in closed systems as other systems. So I want to be more optimistic about our ability to intervene.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this comment. Obviously, this is the last resort in my mind as well. Let's put it in more, let's say, more optimistically. So whenever you see something that is related to entropy, it probably means, let's say, on the technological schedule, it would be much easier to stop, like probably what you are doing is with metformin. You are thinking about stopping, right? You're probably not thinking about reverting at this stage. So I would say, let's say, if we're talking about 5 to 10 years, we should probably more focusing on stopping. And then, if we are done with that, we probably may entertain ourselves with ideas to fight second law of thermodynamics, but that would be a bit more challenging. We should I'm not brave enough.
Great point. So my question is, you are showing very nicely two components, that one of them is more stochastic and linear, and the other is more exponential. But I was surprised that you couldn't show it in electronic medical record. I think that would be...
I can.
Oh,
well, unfortunately,
it's
not in the slides.
You showed only the linear.
Yes, I showed only the linear because for me this is the most relevant phenotype because that controls the resilience. And if you now show the next one in terms of the variance explained, it would be hyperbolic. The variance would explode at 120 years exactly. I mean, with electronic medical records in 500,000 people, we can establish that for sure. And if you look at the diseases that are caused by that component, you would have the senescence-associated diseases. So I hope that this is in some wide sense senescence, but I'm not yet brave enough to talk in front of professionals, so I will work it out.
Maybe 2 quick questions, and then we have to stop.
All right, very interesting talk. One comment, one question as well. On the question on whether mice have resilience or not, I would probably criticize this a little bit because I think we need to think about a biological shift at when age of reproduction is met, right? And that scales for mice and humans, right? And so I think that you will probably find resilience during this period of time, but one can discuss that. The other question, the question I have though is, if I understand this your proposal correctly here, you're saying that there is a discrete point at which you lose resilience and the system falls apart, right? Mm-hmm. However, the system is complex enough that you have many of these points. My question is, at what level do you think you can identify these individual points? Is it at the molecular level, or is it at the cellular level, or an organ system? Or does it not matter where you look?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me comment on both questions. So obviously, living systems are collections of many systems, and each of them has its own resilience. So that's why what I'm saying is that humans and flies or mice, doesn't matter, have one component which is the slowest one. It's related to innate immunity. I mean, we see it's related to, so it's an organism level system. So it has the largest fluctuations, it has the longest response time, and this response time increases almost to infinity, close to death. So when I'm talking about resilience, I'm talking about the resilience in this weakest system. So even when this system fails, all the other systems still may have resilience. What's important for mortality and morbidity is the weakest link. So that's why I'm calling that resilience that is associated with the weakest system as resilience, because everything else is still stable. So.
But you're not saying we know what that system is, right?
Well, it's an organism level thing. So of course, I demonstrated that I can have the same answer in DNA methylation from blood cells, from blood cell counts, from physical activity. So the weakest system produces fluctuations because all other systems are following. So you should be able to see the traces of disintegration in the weakest system by measuring any other system. But this is, of course, a little bit brave theoretical proposal, but at least in few signals it looks like that.
So thank you again. Very, very interesting. And actually, I was going to ask the same question that Harry did about resilience in mice, because physiologically, you see resilience. They grow, they're very stable, and so somehow there's a disconnect there in terms of the mathematical model and the physiology that we see, I think. But my question is, why do we not see this resilience and then loss of resilience in humans in the Gompertz curve, and why in mice is the Gompertz curve also exactly the same?
Very interesting question. I just got this paper accepted to Nature Communications, which has specific discussion on the difference between the Gompertz mortality curve in mice and humans. To put it plain, we got the mouse, intervention testing program data, all the controls, and we measured the actual mortality curve in all those thousands of mice. So in mice, in flies, in C. elegans, you have the mortality that is going exponentially with age till the average lifespan, and then it plateaus. So the plateau, the actual mortality at the plateau is the same as the mortality rate doubling time. And this is true, for mice. So think about that in humans. So the mortality rate doubling time is 1 over 10th year, 0.1. So if you look at the Gompertz curve, it goes through the average lifespan, nothing changes, there is no plateau whatsoever, right? Since the average lifespan, it reaches from 0.1 to almost 1, right? 1 order of magnitude without stopping, and there is a discussion if there is plateau there or not. So what I'm saying first is that there is a very big difference between the mortality curves in mice and humans. So second, back to your question about the disconnect. Once again, animals and humans are infinitely dimensional systems, and up till the very last moment, the resilience exists in all dimensions but one. So that the only dimension along which the system disintegrates has no resilience. So that's why there is, I think, lots of disconnect, because in some specific experiments, in most systems, you still observe the resilience. What's important is that there is one dimension which is associated with SASP, IL-6, all our favorite, all the hallmarks of aging, right? That thing is unbound. You simply exponentially disintegrate along that dimension. So, let's say, I would be happy to discuss it maybe privately. There are, fortunately or unfortunately, not small differences between mortality curve, the character of the markers of aging in mice and in humans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Don't run off. Okay. So that takes us through the morning session. We have a lunch now, and please come back at 1:45, because we're actually going to hear about, well, it's only 30 minutes, so. 137.5, come back, and we'll have a discussion on clinical research.